This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. We are back, trotting the boards, the digital boards with old Pulp and Slick. This is Art of Darkness. I'm Kevin Kautzman, and here for your listening pleasure, entering from I guess Center Zoom is Brad Kelly. Brad, how are you?
Good, man. How are you?
I'm doing all right. It's a beautiful day here in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Yeah, you guys get like 7 of those a year or something, I think.
Sure.
Right?
I mean, this is one of our nice days, and all the world's a stage, and we are merely podcasters. Mm-hmm. This is a core episode, and we're going to be asked. This is the first of a very special set of core episodes we're doing about the Bard, old Willie Shakespeare. The most important author and creative person in the English language, the most important English artist to ever have lived. And Brad, of course, will follow up with the actual history. I'm giving the regime history of Willie Shakespeare. I'm giving the court history, the Stratfordian history, this idea that an undereducated rube from the country could have contributed so mightily to the world of arts and letters, which of course we know has to just be nonsense. So this is going to be really a 2-part episode. Brad, what are you going to do after I give you the basic education? You're doing the Oxfordian position on the next episode, correct?
Yeah, right. So, for people who maybe aren't aware, there is a huge hot debate about who actually wrote the plays attributed to William Shakespeare. And among the detractors of the sort of conventional academic line, the most popular alternative candidate, the man for whom there is the most circumstantial evidence that he may in fact have written the plays, is a guy named Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. So I'm going to be doing very soon, not today, but it'll be coming out hot on the heels of this one, an Art of Darkness episode on Edward de Vere.
And then, of course, we're going to ask everybody what they believe when we're done. And there will be dark rooms aplenty to discuss this. So it's a bit of a cage match here.
It is.
I'm the bear and you are exiting pursued by me.
Right. There you go. Yeah. I'm hoping that this leads to, there are a lot of people who've spent a lot of their career sorting through this and arguing about it. And we're certainly not as informed as some of those people on either the Stratford or the Oxfordian side. But yeah, hopefully this leads to some interesting conversations and somebody can come and, I don't even, I was going to say prove us right or prove us right. I don't even know that, give us more to understand the situation.
We want to enter the fray. We want to join into the discussion, and as ever on Art of Darkness, we are here to learn with our audience and to share our learning as we go. Brad, I got to start with a pre-question before the usual question, which is to pod or not to pod.
Oh,
that is the question.
Yeah.
What do you think? Shall we pod?
We should
pod. This be the shortest? Okay, we should pod.
We should probably pod at this point. Yeah.
that would be a horrible tease if we weren't to pod.
Just shut it down. Yeah.
And when he delivers that speech, if he were to stop being, you'd have serious second act problems.
Well, that's
in
true.
Hamlet if he just stopped.
Yeah, structurally, that's a real nightmare.
Right. So, obviously we're talking about William Shakespeare, and this is a special part one of two. Brad will be doing the Oxfordian position. I am doing the Stratfordian angle. I have some thoughts written down here. I've got voluminous notes, but I got to ask the standard Art of Darkness opening core question for Brad. Core episode. What do you know about Willie Shakes? What do you know about William Shakespeare, the Stratfordian, the court history? Yeah.
Yeah. So I actually know a lot more than I did, say, 6 weeks ago, because I've been preparing to talk about Edward de Vere, and talking about him as a sort of Shakespeare candidate. You end up learning a lot of stuff about the man from Stratford. It is, to my understanding, according to the existing documentation, it is true that he didn't have really much in the way of a documented education. I believe his parents, the argument goes, his parents were illiterate. And then perhaps his children were illiterate as well, though that may be debated. At some point in the 1590s, he's born in 1564, 1590, early 1590s, he releases under the name William Shakespeare, a long epic poem called Venus and Adonis comes out. It is quite popular. Up until that point, not a whole lot is known about him, except he was baptized and he was married. And then there's a bunch of litigation. He sued a bunch of people. A bunch of people sued him. He was involved in a theater. He was an actor. He supposedly wrote a bunch of these plays, though many of them never really were on in between covers until after he died in 1616. So in a way, kind of a mysterious figure as far as the documentation goes. So beyond that, I don't know a whole lot about him as a man.
Sure. And of course, that's a great entree, a great appetizer to all of this. This is misty. And that's the part of the fun of this one. This isn't like doing the Bukowski bio where we have day by day kind of what he was up to, and to a degree, right? This is right at the edge of the historical past. We can't quite grok exactly what was happening when. So we're going to try to paint in a portrait of the man. And then also when Brad takes over on the next episode, he's going to contrast a lot of what I'm delivering here. So it's kind of a Rashomon by way of our leotard.
Yeah.
And I want to preface this too by encouraging everybody to wipe the idea of Shakespeare as a playwright from their minds in terms of what we might think of contemporary playwrights. Contemporary playwrights have a lot to do with what Shakespeare did in terms of form, but very little to do in terms of what Shakespeare did by way of status. A better comparison would be somebody like Steven Spielberg, or even or Villeneuve. These auteur filmmakers who are making extremely popular entertainment. So you hear Shakespeare now today, particularly I think in America, but probably just generally, and there's this sort of lofty kind of idea that it's sort of fancy and upper brow and all this, and that's completely wrong. You know, he was writing for the masses. He was writing for the sweaty, nasty crowd. He was writing for whores and frequenting whores and going among whores, and actors didn't have that much more status than women of the night. I mean, they could be very famous, but they were sort of adjacent to that. It was like a nasty, rough profession, not unlike Hollywood now.
Right,
I mean, we've had late, scandals. I mean, you think about Harvey Weinstein and all of that business, and all the,
the public theater was teetering on the edge of respectability. Like, it wasn't, depending on who you were, your perspective of the theater might be, oh, that is completely degenerate.
Absolutely. Yeah. And they were maneuvering, Shakespeare was trying to maneuver the audience away from lowbrow body comedy. There's a fellow who we're going to talk about who is very famous. We're going to talk about him on the After Dark. So this is a good segue. Let me tease that. So every episode we always do an extra 20, 30 minutes. This one will probably go a little longer even. That is for patrons, Patreon and Substack, our subs on Substack and our patrons on Patreon. And you can find everything at artofdarkpod.com. If you want that bonus content, go over there. Also, we've started releasing the core episodes a week early for patrons. So this will come out here today after we record for patrons. If you want to get it early, get get over there, support the pod. We put a lot of work into this show, and we appreciate all our patronage, all the patronage we get. We got to pass the hat, man. I mean, it's show business, baby. Let's go.
It is. Yeah. Shakespeare would have sued half of the audience by this point.
Absolutely.
Probably.
Right. Yeah. You got to go to patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod, or else you're going to be hearing from the show's lawyer, Dan Baltic. We recently went on Book Club from Hell, too. That was a lot of fun. Those guys are great. I've been checking out their pod, and we went on and we talked about Point Omega from the great Don DeLillo. So if you can't get enough of Pulp and Slick over here, check out Book Club from Hell. And
it should be out it should be out. I don't know what their turnaround is, but it'll be out soon.
Yeah, it's gonna be good. All right, so let me tease the After Dark. I've got 3 things for the bonus. We're going to talk about the most famous comic actor of the period, William Kemp, and his body dances. He was famous for but apparently this guy could like peek his head out from behind the curtain and they'd fucking die. He was able to just like with a wiggle of his eyebrow, he was able to make him freak out. But his dance,
like laughing or
laughing. He would just crushed this guy.
It's the Will Ferrell of his day.
It's
funny to look at him.
Just a funny guy, just a funny looking guy. We're going to talk about a little bit about the sexuality in Shakespeare's England. They call it Elizabethan England, but I prefer to call it Shakespeare's England. We privilege writers and especially playwrights on this podcast. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to get into that on the core episode here as we get going to, because I think things are maybe not quite what people would have expected. Like I think if you ask the average person on the street, hey, in Elizabethan England in Shakespeare's time, when were they getting married? They'd probably tell you like really young, and it's actually not. It's a little. They were delaying marriage. They tried to delay marriages into the mid-20s or even later because for financial reasons. Which to this day now we've just continued to extend it out into people aren't getting married, or they're well. In any case, all right, and then we're going to talk about his phrases and neologisms that you use every day or every so often. Your language is Shakespearean, whether you know it or not. So we're going to talk about those things on the After Dark. All right. Well, let's get into it. I'm going to start with the biography. William Shakespeare was born on April 23rd, 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire, England. Have you been to Stratford?
Have you ever been there? No, I have not been to England.
Well, we have to remedy that. We will. Yeah. We've told people before we will fly private. If anybody wants to bring us over, we're happy to do it. I think I'm still allowed in the UK. I'll have to consult Dan Baltic again. But yes, lovely little sort of village, old timey vibes, and of course the Royal Shakespeare Company. They perform Shakespeare's work there. It's sort of like if you're a Shakespeare stan, this is a pilgrimage site for sure.
Though, man, I'm just realizing episode's going to be. I'm really looking forward to what we're doing here, but this episode's going to be a little difficult for me to sit through and not constantly be going henpecking all these quote unquote facts.
Right. Well, you're gonna get your turn.
So I'm gonna try to keep it to myself more or less.
Oh, and I have to mention the sources. So the primary source for this core episode of Art of Darkness is Peter Ackroyd's Shakespeare: The Biography, and this is a really fine book. He also apparently wrote London: The Biography, and when he gets Shakespeare out of Stratford and into London in the second part of the book, you can tell that this is a man who is obsessed with the history of that great city. Cool. And we're gonna read some from that, and it's just fascinating and very, very cool. And if you're a London file like I am, just really, really exciting. And it's very interesting to remember, of course, London by the time Shakespeare arrived was already an ancient city. So
Oh, there's so many interesting characters running around London at that time. It's endless. It's
At all times. Yeah, it
like
is
pretty
a
much the whole population of London in the late 16th century has a Wikipedia page. It's kind of crazy. Yeah.
right. I mean, it really was the capital of the world for
Mm-hmm.
any number of centuries, and it still holds an outsized influence that
Mm-hmm.
many Americans are maybe a little oblivious to. But if you spend any time there, it's a little overwhelming. Um, and then I have from Joseph Papp and Elizabeth Kirkland, Shakespeare Alive. America's foremost theater producer brings Shakespeare's England to life.
Cool.
So I've got some good stuff there that'll help color in the period. All right, let's go. So what do I have here? I'm going to read from the Ackroyd book, the very beginning. William Shakespeare is popularly supposed to have been born on the 23rd of April, 1564, or St. George's Day. The date may, in fact, have been the 21st or 22nd of April, but the coincidence of the national festival is at least appropriate. Of course, St. George's Day is the Saints' Day of England. It's the big day. When he emerged from the womb into the world of time with the assistance of a midwife, an infant of the 16th century was washed and then swaddled by being wrapped tightly in soft cloth. Then he was carried downstairs in order to be presented to the father. After this ritual greeting, he was taken back to the birth chamber, still warm and dark, where he was laid beside the mother. She was meant to draw to her all the diseases from the child before her infant was put in a cradle. There's going to be a lot of stuff here that will remind us that these folks had a completely different cognition of reality from us.
Mm-hmm.
Totally different. These are pre-moderns. They're right on the edge of modernity. Shakespeare kind of helped invent the modern and invent the human, but we're right on the edge of it. A small portion of butter and honey was usually placed in the baby's mouth. It was the custom in Warwickshire to give the suckling child hare's brains reduced to jelly. The date of Shakespeare's christening, unlike that of his birth, is exactly known. He was baptized in the Church of the Holy Trinity in Stratford on Wednesday, the 26th of April, 1564. In the register of that church, the parish clerk has written Guilelmus Filius Johannes Shakespeare. He slipped in his Latin and should have written Johannes with an I instead of an E. The infant Shakespeare was carried by his father from his birthplace in Henley Street down the High Street and Church Street into the church itself. The mother was never present at the baptism. John Shakespeare and his new born son would have been accompanied by the godparents, who were otherwise known as godsips or gossips. On this occasion, the godfather was William Smith, a haberdasher and neighbor in Henley Street. The name of the infant was given before he was dipped in the font and the sign of the cross marked upon his forehead. At the font, the gossips were exhorted to make sure that William Shakespeare heard sermons and learned the creed as well as the Lord's Prayer in the English tongue. After the baptism, a piece of white linen cloth was placed on the head of the child and remained there until the mother had been churched or purified. It was called the chrism cloth, and if the infant died within a month, was used as a shroud. The ceremony of the Reformed Anglican faith in the time of Elizabeth still favored the presentation of apostle spoons or christening shirts to the infant, given by the gossips, and the consumption of a christening cake in celebration. They were, after all, celebrating the saving of young William Shakespeare for eternity. Of his earthly life, there was much less certainty. In the 16th century, the mortality of the newly born was high. 9% died within a week of birth. It's like 1 in 10. Yeah. And a further 11% before they were a month old. So 1 in 5 wouldn't make it to a month. In the decade of Shakespeare's own birth, there were in Stratford 62.8 average annual baptisms and 42.8 average annual child burials. You had to be tough or from a relatively prosperous family to survive the odds. It is likely that Shakespeare had both of these advantages. All right. Here's a bit. The first test of Shakespeare's own vigor came only 3 months after his birth. In the parish registers of the 11th of July, 1564, beside the record of the burial of a weaver's young apprentice from the High Street was written, Hic incipit pestis. Here begins the plague. In a period of 6 months, some 237 residents of Stratford died, more than a tenth of its population. A family of four expired on the same side of Henley Street as the Shakespeares, but the Shakespeares survived. Perhaps the mother and her newborn son escaped to her old family home in the neighboring hamlet of Wilmcote and stayed there until the peril had passed. Only those who remained in the town succumbed to the infection. The parents, if not the child, suffered fear and trembling. They had already lost two daughters, both of whom had died in earliest infancy, and the care devoted to their firstborn son must have been close and intense. Such children tend to be confident and resilient in later life. They feel themselves to be, in some sense, blessed and protected from the hardships of the world. It is perhaps worth remarking that Shakespeare never contracted the plague that often raged through London. And we're going to have the plague is going to feature throughout this story. And of course, we just recently lived through something like a plague. I don't know. So very interesting. But we can also see the lineaments of that fortunate son in the character of the land from which he came. Okay, so that's an introduction into Shakespeare. I think it's a good setting of the stage to remember too how close death was to these folks and how different a time it was. And of course, these are country people. Mm-hmm. So not only are humans, little baby humans and adult humans, and one in 10 of your neighbors are just dying, you're seeing life and death and country manners, as Hamlet says, livestock and chickens, and you're killing your own food, and just a lot more immediacy to that stuff. And yet here's the fellow who would, unless of course it was the Earl of Oxford, here's the fellow who would also write Hamlet. Very death right there. Act one. Right. So yeah, something to think about. Okay. I've got a bit more about Stratford here from the same book. Stratford is a meeting place of roads crossing the Avon River. Avon is the Celtic name for river. So literally river.
Hey, that's like where I'm at. Detroit River is over here, which basically is the French for the river.
Oh, is that right?
Something like that. The straight river, like Strait. It's funny.
Remind me to talk sometime, maybe on the After Dark, about how I believe the Mississippi River is cursed. All right.
I believe it.
Yeah. The area had been settled from the Bronze Age. There were barrows and stone circles lying now neglected, and there were lows or graves where meets or open courts once gathered. A Romano-British village was established on the outskirts of the present town, lending weight and substance to the weathered and enduring atmosphere of the place. Stratford means a Roman street. Literally, our text here is the street.
Street beside the river.
The river.
No wonder Shakespeare had inventive words. It's like, listen, you guys only got about 12 words, it seems to be. We're gonna have to stretch it out a little bit.
Yeah. The guy from Street on River never met a metaphor he didn't like.
Right.
Yeah, it literally means a street, a paved road or highway crossing a ford. In the 7th century, a monastery was established by the banks of the river. This was first in the possession of Ethelred, subordinate king of the Hwiccas, but was then transferred into the ownership of Egwin, Bishop of Worcester. And it goes on. It began to prosper in the 13th century. A fair of 3 days was instituted in 1216, and so forth. The open country, the medieval town itself was approximately the same size as it was at the time of Shakespeare's birth. So this is interesting. To be aware of continuity, to be settled within it, was in a real sense his birthright. He would go off to London, but he would return to Stratford frequently, and he would leave his family in Stratford. He went on, he had family there, and he was like, nope, I've got to go to the big city. I got to go and make it. The open country beyond the town has been described as tumbled down, covered with thorn bush and populated by rabbits. There were few trees and no hedges, but flat land all around, sprinkled with cowslips and clover and yellow mustard. There had been a church in Stratford dedicated to the Holy Trinity since the 13th century. It was erected beside the river of local undressed stone and yellow stone from the Campden quarries, in the utmost harmony with the landscape. It possessed a wooden steeple and was surrounded by elm trees with an avenue of lime trees leading to the north porch. Shakespeare would have known the ancient bone house on the north side of the chancel, where the skeletons of the long dead had been deposited. It had also been a dormitory for the singing boys and a study for the minister. Shakespeare and his contemporaries were familiar with death, although this did not prevent Juliet from crying out against the charnel house, with its reeky shanks and yellow chapel skulls. Local legend suggests that the playwright had this bone house in mind when he wrote this passage in Romeo and Juliet, and local legend may be right. And we'll go and we'll have to come back to it. If Shakespeare knew one public building in Stratford thoroughly well, it was the chapel of this guild. So of equal antiquity was the Guild of the Holy Cross, established in the beginning of the 13th century. This was a society of lay people devoted to the festivals and institutions of their city. It was a friendly society where, by payment of an annual subscription, its members would be assured of a fitting funeral. But it was also a communal society with its own wardens and beadles who supervised the interests of the town as well as the benefactions of the church. So he would know this place, and it was erected beside the school where he was taught, and each weekday morning he attended prayers there. And then there were the bells. The little bell called the boy to school in the morning, the great bell tolled at dawn and dusk, and there was the surly, sullen bell of the sonnet that tolled at the time of dying and the time of burial. All right. So just giving a little flavor of the sort of old town that he grew up in.
Yeah.
So he was born 5 years after the coronation of Elizabeth I. And the divide between Catholics and Anglican Protestants would figure heavily into his life. We'll talk a little bit about his religiosity. He may have been a crypto-Catholic. His father, there's strong evidence that his father was at the very least a recusant, which is someone who would not attend Anglican services. And my understanding is that if you failed to do so, I think once a month, you'd get fined. You had to go to the point where they would take your land.
Right.
Yeah, pretty heavy stuff. And we'll talk more about it as we go along. So that's an interesting little thread to pay attention to. So born to John Shakespeare, a prominent glover and alderman from Snitterfield, and Mary Arden, from a wealthy landowning family, Shakespeare entered the world in Stratford upon Avon. We know he was baptized. And again, this celebration of his birthday corresponding with St. George's Day is probably lends to your conspiracy theory a little bit, doesn't it, Brad? The idea that the national poet was born on the nation's Saint Day.
You got to start tying these things together. It's a little
few threads, right?
Yeah.
As the third of 8 children and the eldest surviving son, Shakespeare's early life laid the foundation for what he would become. So I want to talk about his father and his mother. He came from what you would call a good family. Like his father would effectively become the mayor of the town. So this is a little bit about the family's background. The first mention of the name in English records, and this is the name Shakespeare. Now maybe this is a little much. Well, let's just read it. Is of William Shakespeare in 1248. It's funny, and this is a little crass and lowbrow, but on Twitter, the Haktua girl going around. I was thinking to myself, like, this is how people got surnames in the past.
Right. Her name would now be Leslie Haktua or whatever. Yeah.
Right. I mean, somebody shook their spear. That's Shakespeare. That's what he is. Yeah. In 1248, he came from the village of Clopton, just a few miles outside Stratford. From the 13th century, the name often occurs in Warwickshire records. It was a family name of long local settlement, in a literal sense, part of the landscape. This may help to explain the rootedness of Shakespeare himself within English culture. Thomas Shakespeare was living in Coventry in 1359. William Shakespeare dwelled in the southern part of Balsall in 1385. Adam Shakespeare was part of the manor of Baddesley Clinton in 1389. The Religious Guild of Knowle had its members Richard and Alice Shakespeare in 1457, subsequently joined by Ralph Shakespeare in 1464. It's, and so forth. I mean, there's English, English, English.
Hmm.
Let's see here. Shakespeare's father, John Shakespeare, embarked at an early age on a prosperous career. Although there were already Shakespeares settled in Stratford, he was a native of Snitterfield. His younger brother, Henry, remained a Snitterfield farmer. But these freaking Anglo names, dude. Yeah. His younger brother, Henry, remained a Snitterfield farmer, but John did not choose to work only in the family business. He wished to pursue other trades as well. He was in the tradition of striving first sons, moving upwards through the world. His own son would follow him. John Shakespeare left the farm in order to be enrolled as an apprentice to a glover in Stratford. The most plausible candidate for his master is Thomas Dixon, who is the innkeeper of the Swan at the bottom of Bridge Street, as well as a master glover. People needed gloves. Yeah. You could devote your life to being that. His wife came from Snitterfield, so that's an obvious connection. John Shakespeare's apprenticeship lasted for 7 years. 7 years apprentice.
Learning how to make gloves.
To be a glover, to make fine gloves.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. That's how long it took us to learn how to.
Those gloves are probably awesome.
If anybody wants to apprentice to us for 7 years, you could be an apprentice podcaster.
Yeah.
We're taking applications.
Yeah, it's like you hear about those apprenticeships of like what was it? That documentary a while back, Jiro Dreams of Sushi. If you're a sushi apprentice, you just like make the rice for a decade and then they finally let you do something else. Podcasting, I don't know what that would be. You can tweet. You can tweet for 7 years.
Yeah, you can do social for us. Yeah. artofdarkpod@gmail.com. Yeah, he was then 27 in 1556. He was listed as a glover. And he would already have pursued the trade for a few years. In later documents, he is described as a widower or dresser of tawed or untanned white leather. He soaked and scraped the skins of horses and deer, sheep and hounds before softening them with salt and alum. They were placed in pots of urine or excrement before being laid out in the garden to dry. It was a messy and smelly business, much like podcasting. From the evidence of his drama, Shakespeare had announced aversion to unpleasant smells, had a pronounced aversion. When the skins had been rendered tender and pliant, they were cut to pattern with knife and scissors as they assumed the shape of gloves, purses, belts, and bags. They were then hung on a rod by the window in order to attract custom. Shakespeare often mentions the trade and its products in his plays. He knows the varieties of leather from dog skin to deer skin and lists the assortment of items that his father sold, from shoes of neat's leather to bridles of sheep's leather and the bags of sow skin carried by tinkers. Is not parchment made of sheepskins? Hamlet's question is answered by Horatio with a further refinement. Aye, my lord, and of cow's skins too. Gloves, particularly those made of chevril or kid skin, are praised by Shakespeare for their softness. There are references to soft churl conscience and a wit of churl that stretches from an inch narrow to an ell broad. Shakespeare describes gloves continually, whether worn in the hat or thrown down as a pledge. In The Merry Wives of Windsor, Mistress Quickly remarks upon a great round beard like a Glower's paring knife. This is the language of close observation. John Shakespeare had a ground floor shop at the front of his house, looking out upon Henley Street, with outbuildings at the back for stretching and drying. He found employment here for 1 or 2 apprentices as stitchers. His sign was a pair of Glover's compasses. He also set up a stall on market days by the High Cross, where the cheapest gloves sold at 4 pence a pair. Lined and embroidered items were, of course, far more expensive. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, you get the idea. I mean, his father was a member of the Glovers Guild. Making and selling of gloves was well-developed and thriving trade. There were 23 glovers in the town.
Whoa.
So, I mean, people needed these. I imagine, when you think about all the farm labor and different weather and different occasions, I imagine, so there's, probably high fashion gloves all the way down to, I gotta have, my 10 sons need gloves for this season.
Yeah.
There's money
you'd be buying, everybody would own a few pairs, but still, that seems like a lot. 23.
Yep. Yeah. There's more too. Like other glovers, they had to hustle. His father was a hustler. All right. Yeah. John Shakespeare also acted as an unlicensed wool broker or brogger. He was into crypto. He was into wool at the time. Crypto, the wool. Information was laid against him in court that on 2 occasions he had illegally purchased wool at 14 shillings per toad.
Oh, he didn't get his permit, did he?
He didn't get his permit. They love their permits over there. Oi, mate, you got your TV license?
Right, you got your permit?
Oi, mate, you got your permit to have a permit? They literally force you to pay for TV. It's crazy. Like just state
for
mandated.
Like having a TV.
For having a TV.
Right.
Yeah. His actions were illegal because he was not a member of the wool staple, a kind of guild. He wasn't in the union. Yeah. But more importantly, he laid down the sums of 140 pounds for one transaction and 70 pounds for the other. These were very large amounts indeed. They suggest that John Shakespeare was a wealthy man. That is why he could afford to speculate in property. He bought a house in Greenhill Street just down the road from Henley Street and rented it out. He bought 2 further houses with gardens and orchards for 40 pounds. He rented another house to one William Burbage, who may or may not have been related to the London acting family, who we're going to talk about. Burbage was the most famous actor in the period. There's going to be almost like a mini episode inside this episode about Burbage. It's going to be, I want to cover him because it gives some additional flavor to what life was like at the time. So we'll talk about the Burbage actor.
Cool.
He also lent money at an illegal rate of interest to his neighbors. Based. Yeah. We do a little usury.
Would he break their legs if they didn't pay on time? Like, what kind of level of legality are we talking here?
Might have been loan sharking a little bit. Yeah. A trade which passed under the unhappy name of usury. Now the banks just do it. Now the banks just jam you with an 8% mortgage and take all the interest up front. And we look the other way, don't we? Yeah, the legal rate was 10%, but John Shakespeare lent 100 pounds to a business colleague at interest of 20%.
Yeah,
and a further 80 and a further 80 pounds to another contemporary at the same rate. He charged the excess because it had become standard practice. He could get away with it, in other words. Money lending was itself widely accepted in a period where there were no banks or credit facilities, and it was even one in which his son engaged from time to time. According to one social historian, such financial dealings were extremely widespread. Okay, all right, well, doesn't make it right or good. And in fact, necessary for the smooth running of the community. Okay, well, all right. Yeah. Of usury, William Harrison wrote that it is practiced so commonly that he is accounted a fool that doth lend his money for nothing. And here we are now. The sums of which John Shakespeare dealt were nevertheless very large. When observing his payment of 210 pounds for wool and his loans of 180 pounds, a contrast might be made with his father's entire estate, amounting to less than 40 pounds. The son had far outstripped the affluence of his father. It was a tradition of striving that his own son would inherit. So John Shakespeare was a canny and prosperous businessman. There have been speculations, though, about his literacy. He signed with a mark rather than a signature, which suggests that he could not write. There's some deeply satisfying, to some commentators, people are satisfied with the idea that like our Shakespeare, his father couldn't read and write. People kind of enjoy that. But again, this kind of lends to your camp, doesn't it? To the other position. Like, is this plausible? How plausible is this?
Right.
Let's get into this too, because this talks about his father's religion. All right. For centuries, scholars have argued over the possibility that Shakespeare's father was a secret adherent of the old faith, the one true faith, the Holy Roman Catholic Apostolic Church. The question is confused by the perplexing circumstances of the time when a person's professed faith might not have been his or her real faith, and when there were nice distinctions and gradations in any religious observance. There were conflicting loyalties. You might be a Catholic who attended the Reformed services for the sake of propriety or to escape a fine. You might be a member of the new communion, yet one who loved the rituals and festivals of the old church. You might be undecided, leaning one way and then another in the quest for certainty. You might have no real faith at all. The evidence for John Shakespeare is similarly equivocal. He had his son baptized within the rites of the Anglican Communion, and the minister Bretschgirdle was a Protestant. But John Shakespeare might also have concealed within the rafters of the roof at Henley Street an explicit spiritual testament. There are many scholars who doubt the authenticity of this document, believing it to be a fabrication or a plant, but its provenance seems genuine enough. It has been shown to be a standard Roman Catholic production distributed by Edmund Campion, who journeyed to Warwickshire in 1581 and stayed just a few miles from Stratford. Campion himself was a Jesuit priest, 0 days without Jesuit tricks, who had traveled from Rome on a secret and ultimately fatal mission to England, both to bolster the faith of native Catholics and to convert those who were wavering in their allegiance. Jesuit missionaries were not welcome in England, especially after the Pope's excommunication of Elizabeth in 1570, and Campion was eventually apprehended, tried, and sentenced to death. Yeah. The spiritual testament found in Henley Street included John Shakespeare's obedience to the Catholic, Roman, and Apostolic Church, and invocations to the Virgin Mary and my angel guardian, as well as to the succor of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. It could not be a more orthodox or pious document. It was printed or transcribed with blanks left for the specific details of the testator. Here, John Shakespeare's mark or signature appeared, as well as the information that his particular patron saint was Saint Winifred. This saint had her shrine in Holywell, Flintshire, which was a place of pilgrimage for the wealthier Catholic families of Warwickshire. If the testament is a forgery, only a well-informed forger would know the details of a local saint. More doubts are raised by the notation. If John Shakespeare could not write, then who added the reference to Winifred? But was there another member of the Shakespeare family who could read and write by 1581? There is one clue. In this Catholic testament, there is reference to the danger that I may be possibly cut off in the blossom of my sins. In Hamlet, the ghost laments that he was cut off in the blossoms of my sin and invokes the Catholic doctrine of purgatory. The ghost is, of course, that of the Father.
Okay. Yeah.
So there's some crypto Catholicism here in the story of old Willie Shakes. So we had to I got to get in there, and I'm not jamming that in for personal reasons. This is all over this book. This author's kind of speculating, and I learned a lot about the period and the history. And I knew, of course, that Catholics were being deeply oppressed during this period, but I wasn't quite sure of the details and the nuance of it all.
It's interesting. Well, and once you get Queen Elizabeth on the throne, there's also Mary, Queen of Scots. That's basically the Catholic, and a lot of people thought that she had as much right to the throne as Queen Elizabeth, but she was Catholic, and there are all kinds of conspiracies on both sides of this, and spy networks, and it's actually pretty fascinating.
I mean, it's really wild to think that we basically continue to do this. It's just changed. The flags have changed slightly.
Right.
One of the flags has changed. The other flag is still the same. Hang on here. Brad, tell people about the book club coming up. I gotta check the air conditioning here.
Yep. So, so for patrons and Substack subscribers behind the paywall, we are coming up on another book club meeting. Basically what we do is if you're a paid subscriber, you get a link, you have the date on your calendar, we all meet up. And if you can't make the time, we record it and you can listen to it behind the paywall. For this edition of the Bookends Reading Club, we are reading Cormac McCarthy's final two novels, The Passenger and Stella Maris. So neither one of them is particularly long, but we're trying to do this on July 13th, or we will be doing it on July 13th. So I definitely would recommend kind of getting in there and getting started on those books. They're a little I wouldn't say controversial. They're a little contentious in terms of how they fit into the overall McCarthy oeuvre. So I'm going to be very interested to hear people who, think it's their favorite McCarthy work, and people who think what the hell were they doing even publishing these things? I think we're going to have a cool conversation. So definitely look out for that.
Absolutely. And all the details are always at artofdarkpod.com. And if you join Substack or Patreon and you don't want to join us sort of on Zoom for the book club, it's extra content. You can listen back. We record all of those. So, and of course, we're coming up on McCarthy. We're going to do the McCarthy episode. So stay tuned for that. All right. Here's a little bit about Shakespeare's mother. It is an undoubted fact, Charles Dickens once wrote, that all remarkable men have remarkable mothers. In the lineaments of the mature William Shakespeare, then, we might see the outline of Mary Arden. She is a formidable figure. She could plausibly claim to be part of a family that extended beyond the Norman conquest. The Ardens had been lords of Warwick, and one of their number, Churchill's de Arden, was credited in the Domesday Book with vast expanse of land, huge tracts of land, enormous tracts of land. The immediate beneficiaries of this wealth and gentility were the Ardens of Park Hall in the north of the country of Warwickshire. They were a strongly Catholic family who were eventually harried and persecuted for their faith. There's no proof that the Ardens of the village of Wilmcote were related to the wealthy landowners of Park Hall. In matters of lineage, however, what can be asserted or suggested is more important than that which can be proved. The shared surname was probably enough. It seems likely that the Ardens from whom Mary Arden was descended considered themselves to be connected, in however distant a fashion, with other branches of the Ardens, and indeed with the grand families who were related to other Ardens, families such as the Sidneys and the Nevilles. It has often been suggested that male actors are prone in their earliest years to identify with the mother. They internalize her behavior and adopt her values. This is at least one explanation for the overriding concern of nobility and gentility in Shakespeare's subsequent drama. He was known for playing kingly roles, and the aristocratic world is at the heart of his design. Again, this is one of the arguments that the Oxfordians make. They say, hey, a mere pleb like the man from Stratford could not have known the court intrigues that he covers in all of these various history plays.
Or might not have even been interested in it. I mean, every play is practically about the nobility in some way or another, right? So
right. And the aristocratic world is at the heart of his design. But of course, if his mother had pretensions to it, and his, and his father would, I think I'll cover this as we go, but it's worth saying here. His father had a coat of arms drawn up at one point, but never filed the paperwork. Much later, when our Shakespeare was a wealthy man, he would finish it and formally become a gentleman. And my understanding,
that's like how you get, that's like your entree into becoming the aristocracy, I think.
I don't know the whole, it's like aristocracy adjacent. You're not hereditary nobility, but if you were a gentleman and you were from a gentle family, it was understood that you were a family of quality. And I'm sure it granted certain privileges. And my reading of it is that about 2% of the population were from gentility.
And it had to be sanctioned by sanctioned by the Queen. That would have been Queen Elizabeth.
I think so. Yeah. And so it was, it was sort of like, and they would eventually get that. And his father could have had that. His father became the mayor. I mean, which is what entitled him to send Willie Shakes, our Shakes, to the school, to the public school, which was not open to every child. That's where what limited education he got was there. And he would battle in London with the university wits, and they would talk shit about him.
Oh, sure.
And vice versa. They would especially harangue him for not having Latin or Greek. They would just say this. They would even say this guy couldn't even translate his own work into Latin. Oh shit! What? Oh, ad hoc propter hoc, bitch. With Deote.
Just mic drop. Yeah.
You can imagine a rap battle in Latin.
Right.
If anybody wants to do like a famous rap battles of history between William Shakespeare and Edward de Vere, I would watch that.
There you go. Yeah,
100% would watch that. All right. So let's see here. In the quest for an alternative Shakespeare, which Brad is on right now, it's often been suggested that the dramatist was actually a well-known aristocrat. Among these hypothetical aliases can be found in the 17th Earl of Oxford and the 6th Earl of Derby. So it's a matter of the greatest irony that Shakespeare may have already considered himself to be of noble stock. He may even be alluding to his parents' marriage at the beginning of The Taming of the Shrew. Since once he played a farmer's eldest son, 'twas where you wooed the gentlewoman so well. One thing this author does that I really like is that he does not modernize Shakespeare's language at all, so the pronunciations can get a little gnarly. Mary Arden's father, Robert Arden, was an affluent yeoman farmer who owned 2 farmhouses and possessed more than 150 acres of land. You'd be rich now if you had 150 acres of land in a lot of places. Of such farmers, William Harrison wrote that they commonly live wealthily, keep good houses, and travel to get riches, and with grazing, frequenting of markets, and keeping of servants do come to great wealth. Robert Arden was in fact the most prosperous farmer and the largest landowner in Wilmcote. The village itself was 3 miles from Stratford, situated in cleared woodland. It was close to the very edge of the forest from which the family derived its name. The Ardens were nourished with a specific sense of belonging, and so forth. I want to get into let's see here. In the rooms where they lived were hung painted cloths for decoration and edification. These depicted classical or religious scenes, such as Daniel in the Lion's Den or the Siege of Troy, and would have dominated the interiors of this relatively modest farmhouse. Mary Arden was bequeathed at least one of these painted tapestries in her father's will, and it is most likely to have ended up on a wall in Henley Street. In Macbeth, Shakespeare refers to the eye of childhood that fears a painted Doyle, and Falstaff mentions Lazarus in the painted cloth. We're just drawing the connections, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let's see here. The family house in Henley Street can even now be seen. It is much changed, but still recognizable. You can go and see it. It was originally 2 or perhaps 3 houses, each with a garden and an orchard. It was on the northern side of Henley Street at the edge of the town, with its narrow rooms looking directly onto the thoroughfare. There was very little privacy. At the back of the house, beyond the garden, was an area known as the Guild Pits. This was essentially a stretch of waste ground with a ramshackle road threading within it. The house itself was erected at the beginning of the 16th century in the usual mode of oak timber frame with wattle and daub, and with a roof of thatch. The ceilings of the interiors were lime washed and the walls decorated with painted cloths or patterned all over with the use of wood blocks. Its timbers were much lighter in color than the mock Tudor beams now characteristically stained black or dark brown, and so forth. It was a commodious house with 6 separate chambers, the lower and upper stories connected with a ladder rather than a stairway. You have to imagine 8 children in here.
Right.
I mean, busy, hectic, noisy.
Yeah.
They're in the country, but they're not. I mean, there's not much comparable today in the Anglosphere, I don't think. We don't live this way anymore, that's for sure.
No.
The hall was the principal room of the house, next to the front door and the cross passage. There was a large fireplace here, and the Shakespeare family sat for their meals in front of it. There was a kitchen at the back of the house with its usual complements of a hand-turned spit, brass skillets, and leathern bottles. Beside the hall was the parlor, a combined sitting room and bedroom where the bed itself was displayed as a prized specimen of household furniture. The walls here were heavily patterned and decorated. Across from the hall on the other side of the passage was John Shakespeare's workshop, where the labor of stitching and sewing was undertaken by him and his apprentices. They worked from home, which we're all starting to do now.
Yeah. Nice.
Or return.
Right.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind. I don't think I'd mind being a glover, frankly.
Yeah.
Sounds all right. If it paid well, sounds all right. Yeah.
Brad Kelly, podcaster Glover.
Yeah.
Second.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was also a shop trading with the outside world, with a casement opening onto the street, and as such had a different atmosphere from the rest of the house. You're literally selling the gloves that you're making in the house out your back door.
Cool.
Think about how that would change your relationship with all your neighbors and all the community and all that. It's just so much more immediate.
No, it just ties you into everything. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You wouldn't sell shoddy work. It would,
no, because your reputation's at stake. Yeah,
you'd be wrecked. You'd be wrecked in like a week.
Right.
Like there's no way Chipotle would shut down in a week.
Right.
at this point, it's over.
Yeah. Well, especially you think you got 23 other Glovers. If you're even kind of a jerk, people just go to the other. Guy.
I'm going to the other burrito guy.
Right. Yeah.
That gave me the runs for a week. I got the leeches on me. I'm going to the other burrito guy. I don't know if they used leeches at this point.
I think they did.
I'm really enjoying this because it's giving a flavor of the period and where he was coming out of. You know, from an early age, Shakespeare knew all about the demands of the public. On the floor above, there were 3 bed chambers. Shakespeare would have slept on a mattress of rush stretched on cords between the wooden frame of the bed. In the attic room slept the servants and the apprentices. It was a large house for a tradesman and reinforces the note of affluence in all his father's affairs. It was also a noisy house, a wooden sound box in which a conversation in one part of the house could be clearly heard in another. The creaking of timber and the noise of footsteps would have been a constant accompaniment to household tasks. From his dramas, too, come the unmistakable impressions of the childhood. There are images of stopped ovens and smoking lamps, of washing and scouring, of dusting and sweeping. There are many references to the preparation of food, to boiling and mincing and stewing and frying. There are allusions to badly prepared cakes and unsieved flour, to a rabbit being turned upon a spit and a pasty being pinched. There are many references to what was considered to be woman's work within the home, to knitting and to needlework. But there are also images of carpentering, of hooping, and of joinery. These were the activities of the yard or of the outhouses at the back of John Shakespeare's property. No other Elizabethan dramatist employs so many domestic allusions. Shakespeare maintained a unique connection with his past. That is why, and this is I'm arguing against your episode right now, Brad.
Sure.
With the help of this fine author. That is why the natural world seems to impinge so directly upon him. The house in Stratford had a garden and an orchard. The image of the garden occurs to him in many different contexts, whether that of the body or of the state. An ill-weeded garden is an image of decay. He knows of grafting and pruning, of digging and dunging. In Romeo and Juliet, there's an image of a trailing plant being pressed down to the ground so that it will put forth fresh roots. This is not a scene, perhaps, that would have readily occurred to an urban writer. In all, he alludes to 108 different plants. In his orchards hang apples and plums, grapes and apricots. The argument being made here, in the interest of time, is that this is a man of the country.
Yeah.
No poet besides Chaucer has celebrated with such sweetness the enchantment of birds, whether it be the lark ascending or the little grebe diving, the plucky wren or the serene swan. The spectacle of birds in flight entrances him. He cannot bear the thought of their being trapped or caught or snared. He loves free energy and movement as if they were in some instinctive sympathy with his own nature. All right. So a man of the country is what we're arguing. And that's a very interesting idea, because there's no one who would become more urbane. What do we associate with urbanity more than the theater and plays and Shakespeare? There's very little in the arts that there's nothing really in the arts. You have to be urban.
You kind of need to be urban to have enough of an audience, right?
I mean, you can do theater anywhere, but it's still to this day. I mean, when you say theater, what city do you think in America?
Right, New York City.
New York, yeah. What do you think? And then Chicago, and so forth. And then it's what do you think in the UK? Do you think London? So it's a very interesting idea that this guy, this country, from money, from some status and privilege, as we would say, but from the country.
Right.
All right.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. That's something I had not quite grokked. Okay, great. So a little bit more about his childhood here. Let's see. Yes. It's become customary to place the young Shakespeare in the conventional Elizabethan world of childhood, engaged in games such as penny prick or shovelboard, harry racket, or barley break. In his own place.
They're just making up words at this point.
You're just making shit up here. If anybody knows what penny prick is, find Brad at Twitter. Brad does the Twitter, the X. What is it? At Art of Dark Pod. Everything's Art of Dark Pod. At Art of Dark Pod. Artofdarkpod.com. Yeah. Fun. Penny prick. In his own plays, Shakespeare mentions football and bowls, prisoner's base, and hide and seek. Well, that one I know. As well as the rural games of muss and dun in the mire. Oh, I played some muss and dun in the mire in my days. Hell yeah, baby.
Yeah, sounds great.
Yo. Yeah. He even mentions chess, although he does not appear to know its rules. But it is likely that he was in certain respects an odd child. He was precocious too and observant, but he was one who stood apart. There can be no doubt at all that he devoured books. Much of his early reading comes back in his drama. Has there ever been a great writer who did not spend a childhood in books? I don't know. He'll probably, but Yeah.
According to the Oxfordians. Okay.
He alludes to Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, so beloved by Mistress Quickly, and the old English romances of Sir Delgore and Sir Eglamour and Beavis of Southampton. Master Slender lends Alice Shortcake the Book of Riddles, and Beatrice refers to the Hundred Merry Tales. Some of his earlier biographers concur that he possessed a copy of William Paynter's The Palace of Pleasure and Richard Robinson's translation of Gesta Romanorum, the legends of which form the staple of some of his plots. None of his stuff is original. He's like Stanley Kubrick, where Kubrick always had source material.
So it's an adaptation. Yeah.
Yeah. Even if it was like by the time they're done, you don't recognize the adaptation. But they're working from source material. And so forth. I mean, so he would consume this stuff. Let's see here. Yeah, and he had a big family. And he had brothers, and of course his work would be very oriented toward the family. Oh, this is the business here too, about the gentility. Here, I want to read this. This is good. The conditions in the Shakespeare household were, of course, wrapped in the vital tedium of daily life, beyond the purview of the dramatic imagination. There are, however, stray intimations of status and aspiration. In 1568, the year he became mayor or bailiff of Stratford, John Shakespeare applied for a coat of arms. It was natural and practical for a mayor to have a coat of arms for various memorials and banners. Now that he was appointed to high civic office, he was able to seal his prominence by becoming a gentleman. Those known as gentlemen were those whom their race and blood, or at least their virtues, do make noble and known. I love that. It's like you could be a real bastard, but if your blood makes you noble, you're noble. Yes. You could also earn your way there, but I mean, right. That's like secondary, right? Yeah.
We're gonna see this in the De Vere episode, where it's just like, so wait, what did the stuff that he sort of gets away with is galling. Frankly,
yeah. They comprise some 2% of the population. John Shakespeare wished to be enlisted in this register of the gentle and noble, and to qualify, he would need to demonstrate that he owned property and goods to the value of £250, and that he lived without the taint of manual labor. I got your taint of manual labor right here, you pricks. Your taint right here. Yeah. His wife was supposed to dress well and to keep servants. He presented a pattern for his coat of arms to the College of Heralds, and his application was duly noted. The formula for his arms contained a falcon, a shield, and a spear embossed in gold and silver. The falcon is shaking its wings and holds a spear of gold in its right talon. A little on the nose, right? Mm-hmm. Hence, we interpret Shakespeare. The motto accompanying the device is non sans droict, or not without right. It is a bold assertion of gentility. For unknown reasons, however, John Shakespeare did not proceed with his application. He may have been unwilling to pay the heralds large fees, or he may have had only a passing interest in what essentially, what seems to have been like a civic duty, like a formality. Mm-hmm. But then 28 years later, his son arranged it for him. William renewed his father's application with the original coat of arms and succeeded. At last, his father was a gentleman. And so forth. And they're saying he may have done it to please his mother. Let's read something here. This is just the next chapter, but I think this is interesting. There's so much. This is a very, very fine biography of Shakespeare. I'm holding it up for the YouTube people. This is Peter Ackroyd, Shakespeare, the biography. In 1569, the theater came to Stratford under the auspices of John Shakespeare, the mayor. The new players of London were allowed to perform in the Guildhall and in the inn yards of the town. It's an important moment in Shakespeare's own history, too, when the 5-year-old boy was first able to witness the world of pageantry and seeming. His father invited 2 sets of players to entertain the town, the Queen's men and the Earl of Worcester's men. All of the different troops had patrons.
Yeah, absolutely.
You were either getting the teal bucks or not. It was Teal's men.
Right.
That's a thing. I guess that's a thing. Yeah. But anyway, I mean, eventually Shakespeare and his guys were the king's men.
Right.
Which is it.
Right. Yeah. They were the Lord Chamberlain's men, I think, technically.
And then they became the king's men.
The king's men under James.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Let's see here. It would have indeed have been all around entertainment, complete with music and dancing, singing and tumbling. A little more like circus, like a whole, day.
Yeah,
It'd be
yeah. I
yeah.
think that when you hear the players, my understanding of it in this era, there may be when we think of going to the theater, we're like, I'm going to sit down and we're going to watch a play written out dialogue from start to end, right? And this was much more like gymnastics, carnival stuff, perhaps a staged fight, and perhaps a written dialogue portion, perhaps the reading of a poem. Yeah,
Mhm.
it was
Yeah.
a show.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, you could probably see something like it when you watch The Seventh Seal. I feel it has
Hmm.
maybe potentially a feeling of it, although that's an earlier period from this. But we're still,
Yeah.
yeah. We're going to be doing Bergman later this year or at some point.
Ooh, yeah.
Big, yeah, I do,
That'd be good.
like some Bergman.
Hmm.
Um, let's see here. There were dumb shows and speeches and pageants with drums and trumpets. There were duels and wrestlings. How much the young Shakespeare saw or remembered is an open question, but there is testimony from an exact contemporary who witnessed the players in Gloucester. He recalled that at such a play, my father took me with him and made me stand between his legs, as he sat upon one of the benches where we saw and heard very well. It was a play of king and courtiers, of songs and transformations and colorful costumes. This contemporary goes on to say that this sight took such impression in me that when I came towards man's estate, it was as fresh in my memory as if I had seen it newly acted.
Hmm.
I think he's saying
Okay.
he could see it. I don't even know. He was whatever. He can remember it.
Yeah.
Uh, there were many more opportunities for Shakespeare and his contemporaries to see the London players. 10 groups of them came to Stratford over the next few years as part of their touring circuit. In 1 year alone, 5 companies passed through,
Hmm.
and so forth. I mean, so you get the idea of sort of what, he was getting exposed to. The names of some of the plays and performance convey perhaps the atmosphere. A marriage between wit and wisdom, Cambyses, Orestes, enough is as good as a feast, Damon and Pythias. The longer thou livest, the more fool thou art. Yeah, and so forth.
All right.
The playwrights took their, I like that last one a lot.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
playwrights took their material from anything and everything, from histories to collections of romance, from the classical plays performed at the inns of court to popular burlesque, from spiritual allegory to fantastic legend. It was a world of witty repartee and declamation, but it was also a world of imaginary countries and mysterious islands, of strange seas and caverns, of unvarnished evil and unearthly goodness, of dramatic lament and generally exaggerated feeling. The young Shakespeare could watch these plays unfolding before him. He would inevitably, if unconsciously, acquire a sense of dramatic space and an ear for heightened dialogue or for declamations. It's appropriate that the English drama was coming to slow maturity in the same period as Shakespeare himself. They were both children of their time, sharing a newly awakened sense of possible achievement. Yeah, so there you go. So he had exposure to the theater. It was the popular entertainment of the time. There's no radio, there's no television.
Mm.
People are not literate. And what are you going to do when you've got a fair day? Everybody's
Mhm.
got together. You're going to tell a story. You're going to listen to songs. You're going to play music. It's
Yeah,
all
and
there. It's all immediate.
and it seemed like a lot of events had like a theatrical component. Like I know later on there's like jousting tournaments and stuff, and those would always have like a theatrical component, and like a accession day, which is the anniversary of when whoever's on the throne rose to the throne, would be like a big festival day with theater and competitions and wrestling matches and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, theater was sort of baked into daily, not, I don't want to say daily life, but into the pattern of life, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll co-sign that for
Yeah.
sure. And they had a lot of festivals. There's a lot of saint
Hmm.
days. There are a lot of days
Hmm.
off.
Yeah.
Yeah. They
Yeah.
weren't, they weren't working 50 weeks out of the year, 40
Yeah.
hours a day. It was different. It was more,
Yeah.
I felt this was a little bit more integrated.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to move forward here. Publicly, Shakespeare conformed to the official state religion of his time. And we're talking about Willie here. All
Hmm.
right.
Hmm.
Some researchers suggest the family had Catholic ties. All right. So we already talked about this. We talked about the business in the rafters. In 1591, and this is some years in the future, authorities reported that John Shakespeare had missed church services, citing fear of process for debt, a common excuse used by Catholics to avoid Anglican services.
Hmm.
Further on, William's daughter, Susanna, was listed among those who failed to attend Easter Communion in Stratford. OMG.
Yeah, not good.
Yikes. I mean, they're taking names.
Right. Yeah, they taking roll
Did you
call
change your profile picture to the current thing?
Right.
Do you
Right.
like your job?
Yeah.
I see you
Right.
didn't change your profile to the
Yeah.
latest thing,
Right.
professor.
Right. And it looks like you have 2 or 3 other
I
transgressions
see
here in
I
the
see
past.
your retweets, professor.
Right.
Yeah. You get the idea.
Yeah.
So yeah, we don't know conclusively, but there are hints at this. Okay, all right.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
education was super important to young William. And I know, Brad, you will be talking a lot more about this on the other side, but
Yeah.
there are no records existing that confirm his attendance. It's widely believed he attended the King's New School in Stratford. This free school was established in 1553 and located just a short distance from his home. It provided a rigorous education in Latin grammar and classical literature, standard fare for grammar schools of the Elizabethan era. We're going to move him forward in time now. I think we've sort of given you a sense of place. Let's see here. There's quite a lot in this book about his time at the school and the sort of teachers and everything. Let's see here. Well, let's maybe get a little bit more here. His father went through a little bit of a problem where he had to in 1577 he had to step away from public life. And let me read about this. John Shakespeare's position was all the more precarious because through marriage he had become part of the Arden affinity. In this period of the Catholic Edward Arden was engaged in full feud with the Protestant Earl of Leicester, who had charge of the county and who sent sectarian preachers to Stratford. Any member of the Arden family, however removed, could become an object of suspicion. So the world of religious politics conspired against Shakespeare's father and obliged him to withdraw from public life. It gets heavy. Yeah. His colleagues were reluctant to see his departure, but they understood his reasons. This can be no more than a guess, but it does at least make sense in his subsequent behavior. Shakespeare was 13 at the time of his father's relinquishment of public duty and honor. Any effect upon his son can only be supposed, but the boy was of an age when rank and status are important among his fellows. In such a small and deeply hierarchical society, it seems likely that he felt his father's departure most keenly. When we try to measure his response, it is best to trust the tale rather than the teller. The plays of Shakespeare are filled with authoritative males who have failed. That may, of course, be a definition of tragedy itself, in which case it will be one of the reasons for Shakespeare's intense engagement with it. Many of the central male characters of his drama have been disappointed in the practical business of the world. We may adduce here Timon and Hamlet, Prospero and Coriolanus. This failure does not engender aggression or bitterness on the dramatist's part, quite the contrary. It is invariably the case that Shakespeare sympathizes with failure, with Antony or Brutus or Richard II. As his first biographer, Nicholas Rao, put it of Wolsey in All Is True, he makes his fall and ruin the subject of general compassion. As soon as the male protagonists begin to lose their status, Shakespeare invests them with all the poetry of his being. It may be that John Shakespeare's decline also became the context for his son's preoccupation both with gentility and then with the restoration of family honor. It could also help to elucidate, if not explain, his unprecedented interest in the figure of the king. If the nominal head of the family has failed, it becomes quite natural to create an idealized patriarchy or an idealized relationship between father and son. In any case, Shakespeare himself made sure that he would never suffer his father's failure. All right. So there's a lot of business here about these complex loans, and apparently these they would use this strategy here. So he was a recusant. So he was like lending. They would do these weird, funny loans where like he would give away his property to kind of like hide it from the state. So here's what it says. A recusant such as John Shakespeare could convey his property to safe hands to relatives rather than to friends, and thus avoid the prospect of confiscation. After an agreed interval, the property was then returned. And it goes on. So, yeah. This is the environment he's in. It's very heavy. Things are really, really happening. All right, so we're gonna blast through a little bit of his schooling. Let me read a little. This is quite good. This gets into a little bit of a scandal that he had. I don't want to go too fast. I want to cover this stuff. All right, so he's 15 years old in 1579. And entering a period in life which, according to the Shepherd in the Winter's Tale, there is nothing but getting wenches with child, wronging the ancientry, stealing, fighting. Might as well add fucking to the end of that, right? Yeah. I love that. He's a teenager. There's nothing but getting wenches with child. Yeah. He committed at least one of these offenses and is popularly supposed to have been guilty of two others. But we may prefer to see him as Goethe saw the young Hamlet, as, by the way, fellow podcasters, it's Goethe. You could say Goethe. I don't know how many podcasts in this like little thing that we're in, this constellation of podcasts that we sort of, it's Goethe. It's not that I mispronounce things all the time, but that name for some reason really hangs people up.
Yeah, no, people struggle with it for sure.
Yeah, it's Goatsy.
Goats.
Goat. This is Art of Darkness. Thank you for listening. But we may prefer to see him as Goethe saw the young Hamlet, as a good companion, pliant, courteous, discreet, and able to forget and forgive an injury, which our audience is the same way. Thank you all. If he was also able to discern and value the good and the beautiful in the arts, then he reached the borders of manhood at an appropriate time. In this year were published North's translations of Plutarch, from which he would later borrow, as well as the Euphues of John Lyly, and the Shepherd's Calendar of Edmund Spenser. New forms of prose and new kinds of poetry were all around him. It's possible that his father paid the £5 necessary for his son to continue his schooling after the age of 14. Only after that age, according to the conventional school curriculum, could he have acquired even the less Greek of which Ben Jonson accused him. The age of 14, however, was the hard year when boys became apprentices. The young Shakespeare may have started working for his father in some capacity. This was the standard practice of those who were not apprenticed elsewhere. Nicholas Rowe states that after school, his father could give him no better education than his own employment. Okay, and so forth. It's also been suggested that the young Shakespeare worked as a lawyer's clerk, or that he found he's one of Baltic's interns, or that he, or what does he call them? They're not interns for Baltic. They're associates. Yes, he's an associate. Or that he found employment as a schoolmaster in the country, or that he was called upon for military service, a duty which he would have been liable after the age of 16. It's perhaps significant that the only form of recruitment known to Shakespeare was that of impressment, and that there are many allusions in his plays to archery. But his extraordinary capacity for entry into imagined worlds has misled many scholars. His apparent knowledge of the technical terms of seamanship, even to the details of dry ship biscuits, has, for example, convinced some that he served in the English Navy. You can never overestimate the powers of assimilation and empathy. In the absence of certainty, there have emerged many legends concerning his early years. The most famous of these is his aptitude for poaching. The story concerns his encroachment upon the estate of a local dignitary, Sir Thomas Lucy, and is first mentioned in print by Rowe. Rowe himself gathered it from the actor Thomas Betterton, who had traveled to Stratford in order to pick up any Shakespearean lore. And this is what Rowe wrote about Shakespeare's poaching incident. By a misfortune common enough to young fellows, fallen into ill company, and amongst them some that made a frequent practice of deer stealing, engaged him with them more than once in robbing a park that belonged to Sir Thomas Lucy of Chalcot, near Stratford. For this he was prosecuted by the gentleman, as he thought, somewhat too severely, and in order to revenge that ill usage, he made a ballad upon him. And though this, probably the first essay of his poetry, be lost, yet it is said to have been so very bitter that it redoubled the persecution against him to that degree that he was obliged to leave his business and family in Warwickshire for some time and shelter himself in London. Did you follow that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so you maybe had a little trouble with the law. You
Yeah.
maybe had a little trouble with the law as a young man,
Yeah.
Brad. You might have had a few
Yeah.
entanglements, right? So
Yeah.
they stole a deer. They basically poached a deer on land owned
Mm.
by a noble.
Mm-hmm.
And when they got caught and busted, he thought that the punishment was too severe. So he
Mm.
basically wrote a diss track or whatever you want to call it. He wrote a
Right.
ballad
Mm-hmm.
talking shit about this noble.
Mm-hmm.
And, again, nothing changes.
No.
And that got him in even more trouble. And the theory goes he had to flee to
To
London
London.
because of
All
that.
right. Okay.
Okay.
Cool.
Now, there's some ambivalence around this. Did it really happen? Is it a historical? I don't know. I think it's an interesting little side story there.
Mm-hmm.
All right. He's 18 and his life takes a pivotal turn. So let's get to what do you think can happen at the age of 18 to old Willie Shakes?
Well, let me put on my Oxfordian hat. So, according to the Oxfordians, all we know about him for a fact between baptism and age 18 is that at age 18 he got married.
You nailed it.
Yeah.
You nailed it. Very good, Brad.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's get into it.
Mm-hmm.
Anne Hathaway was the eldest daughter of the house and as such incurred a fair number of household duties, chief among them the care of her younger siblings. As the daughter of a farming family, too, she learned how to bake bread, to salt meat, to churn butter, and to brew ale. In the yard outside the house were poultry and cows, pigs and horses to be fed and reared. Far from being a mésalliance or forced marriage, as some have suggested, the partnership of William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway could have been an eminently sensible arrangement. He was 18, she was 26.
Ooh, spicy.
Age gap.
Yeah.
He may even have exercised a good deal of caution or common sense at his choice of lifelong partner. This was thoroughly in keeping with his practical and businesslike approach to all the affairs of the world. She was 8 years his senior in the year of their marriage. He was 18, she was 26. But in a period of shorter life expectancy, the disparity in age would have seemed greater then than now. That still feels pretty gnarly. 18 and 26 is like, damn.
Yeah. Yeah.
You go like, eh. It was an unusual arrangement since in the 16th century, it was customary for the man to marry a younger woman. Yeah.
It's still
the difference
kind of customary.
Still kind of customary, yeah. The difference in age, it's obviously because men age more slowly. Our brains are just dumb. We're just dumber longer.
That's part of it.
That's my theory. That's my diplomatic way of explaining that.
Yeah.
Right. The difference in age has, of course, aroused much speculation, primarily concerned with the wiles of an older female in coaxing an inexperienced young man into bed and eventual marriage. Yet it might, on the contrary, suggest sexual self-confidence on Shakespeare's part. In any case, the suspicion does less than justice to Shakespeare's judgment and intelligence, which, even at the age of 18, must have been acute. He probably was pretty precocious. I mean,
I imagine.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, he must have been. Yeah. I mean, obviously he was a genius. No, there's no question. It's also an insult to Anne Hathaway, who, like many of the silent wives of famous men, has endured much obloquy. Those biographers who enjoy dramatic speculation, for example, have noted that Shakespeare's history plays harbor many manipulative older women. Okay, fine. One of them, a woman cries out, Hermia cries out, "Oh, spite, too old to be engaged to young." And the Duke in Twelfth Night offers some advice. "Let still the woman take an elder than herself." And goes on to caution, "Then let thy love be yonder than thyself, or thy affection cannot hold the bent, for women are as roses whose fair flower, being once displayed, doth fall that very hour." The spelling of this is gnarly.
Yeah.
So it's not clear if she could read or write. And there's a sonnet placed as the 145th in his sonnet sequence. We're going to linger on the sonnets a bit, which seems oddly situated and out of context. The last two lines suggest that it was in fact composed for Anne Hathaway, who has some claim to being the first extant work of William Shakespeare. So they're saying this sonnet could be the first work, and I'm going to read it.
Oh, okay.
And this is from the Folger in DC.
DC, yeah.
In this sonnet, perhaps written when Shakespeare was very young, the poet plays with the difference between the words "I hate" and "I hate not you." And for poet people, note that the lines of the sonnet are in tetrameter instead of pentameter, tetrameter instead of pentameter. All right, this is not very long. Those lips that love's own hand did make breathed forth the sound that said, I hate, to me that languished for her sake. But when she saw my woeful state, straight in her heart did mercy come, chiding that tongue that ever sweet was used in giving gentle doom, and taught it thus anew to greet. I hate, she altered with an end, that followed it as gentle day. Doth followed night, who like a fiend from heaven to hell is flown away. I hate, from hate away she threw and saved my life, saying, not you. It's very clever.
Okay. Oh, yeah, it is clever.
Yeah. And he's saying hate away is equal to hath away.
Oh,
all right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Playing out her name. Okay.
I hate, from hate away she threw. And, it could have been throwing away her surname, hate away she threw.
Sure. That too. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Very clever. Very cheeky. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So this is interesting. It is to be hoped that love's. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking. So that's called Sonnet 140. That's Sonnet 146.
145.
145.
145.
But it's also thought to be maybe his earliest work.
Yeah.
The sonnets are kind of a mysterious thing in a way, right? The numbering is it seems arbitrary as I've been going through it, and the provenance of them is not particularly well understood in a lot of cases, it feels like. So, yeah.
Indeed. Yes. As with so much of Willie Shakes. It is to be hoped that love's own hand had something to do with the match, since Anne Hathaway was 4 months pregnant by the time of their marriage day.
Get in there, Willie.
Get in there. Yep. Free Willie. Let her rip, baby. It was not unusual. And there are worse things that can happen to you all. Okay. Yeah. I'm just saying that. Life finds a way, as the man said in the great movie about the dinosaurs. Life finds a way. Yeah. It was not unusual in this period for couples to cohabitate before their wedding. Their Stratford neighbors, George Badger and Alice Court, Robert Young and Marjorie Field, had a similar arrangement. It was also customary for both parties to make a troth plight, a verbal contract of marriage before witnesses, which was also known as hand fasting or making sure.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
That's what you expect.
So, yeah, we got to make sure here. So Alice Shaw of Warwickshire declared to William Holder of the same county that I do confess that I am your wife and have forsaken all my friends for your sake, and I hope you will use me well. Yeah. The man took the woman's hand and repeated the same pledge. Only after such a troth plight could the woman give up her virginity. Okay. So you go up in front of witnesses, you're not formally married, but you're like, we're going to get down. Yeah. Let's do this.
Yeah.
The marriage ceremony came later. It was a code of honor marked out by both social and sexual discipline, which we have none of anymore. Zero.
Yeah.
There were, of course, different forms of making sure, varying from a private pledge to a ceremony with a prayer book. But its ubiquity can be measured in the fact that between 20 and 30% of all brides bore children within the first 8 months of marriage.
Yeah.
This informal contract remained firmly in Willie's consciousness. There are many allusions to it in his plays, ranging from Claudio's plea in Measure for Measure that she is fast my wife, to Olivia's demand to Sebastian in Twelfth Night that he plight me the full assurance of your faith. It would also have affected the Elizabethan understanding of dramatic action. When Troilus and Cressida plight themselves, Pandarus exclaims, "Go to a bargain made, seal it, I'll be the witness here, I hold your hand here, my cousins." He is effectively sealing a hand fasting, thus rendering Cressida's subsequent unfaithfulness more execrable. When Orlando declares to Rosalind in the guise of Ganymede, "I take thee, Rosalind, for wife," he is committing himself much further and more deeply than he supposes. It's a social custom now long since discarded and forgotten, but it had profound implications for Shakespeare and his people during that time. All right, so good. We're meeting Anne Hathaway. Yeah. I got some more around this stuff because it's rather important. I'm going to go into the other book here now. that gives a little picture of the period. I got to drink a little water here.
Sure. Yeah.
How are we so far? What do you think about Willie so far? I mean, I know you're all about the Earl on the other side.
And it's funny. I'm kind of playing the devil's advocate because I still don't. I'm still not coming at this 100% convinced that the Earl of Oxford wrote this and it's all flim flam. But it is interesting. I'll say one thing about this. What the Oxfordians will say about all the Shakespeare biography stuff is that what happened, what the Shakespeare biographers, the Stratfordians have done is they've basically taken a half a dozen documents about this early part of Shakespeare's life, and then they've just filled the rest in with speculation. And then that's the story of who Shakespeare is. So, just as a note that all the Oxfordian claim is that, like, yeah, we really don't know very much. We know he married Anne Hathaway, for instance, but we don't know. A lot of the other stuff is like, well, this is the kind of thing people did at that time. That's what a lot of it is.
And that's a lot of this from this book too. I mean, if you go to primary sources, what really do we have? I don't know. I mean,
it's very little. Apparently, it's very little.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
All right. So this is from the Shakespeare Alive book from Joseph Papp. Let's see here. This is a little bit about women in that period. Educated or not, a woman always ran up against the one immutable fact of Elizabethan life. She would never be able to enter the professions because she was a woman. She couldn't become a lawyer. She couldn't be a priest. In fact, some clergymen were still debating heatedly whether or not women even had souls.
God.
A debate that continues to rage on certain corners of Twitter.
Yeah, right.
Isn't that horrible? There's
terrible.
So much misogyny on that site. It's just horrific.
It's pretty. Yeah.
She couldn't be a professional teacher, although she could take care of her own children's early education. And she couldn't be a doctor. If she wanted to work in medicine, she could find a job as an overworked nurse in one of the squalid London hospitals, a midwife in a village, or a searcher for the cause of disease in dead bodies. Oof. The only career open to all Elizabethan women was marriage. Of course, they wouldn't have even have thought of it as a career. I mean, this is a totally different framework of reality. I mean, so this is sort of poorly written. I mean, I'm sure there's a little bit of a political agenda here, but I want to read it to give a picture. A wife's job was to run the household and help her husband in whatever he did. Her work varied according to his. The tasks of a farmer's wife were to go or ride to the market to sell butter, cheese, milk, eggs, chickens, and all manner of corn, and also to buy all manner of necessary things belonging to a household. And this is like when a household was a household.
Yeah.
The house was a business. The house
was a
family. The house was everything. And we have glimmers of that today. I mean, you got to keep your paperwork together. You got to keep your bills paid. You got to keep the mortgage up. But it's not like your neighbors are coming into your, knocking on your back door for like fresh eggs or new gloves or whatever. It's a little different.
Right.
Yeah. The shopkeeper's wife helped in the shop, perhaps keeping the account books, and made sure the household ran smoothly. And see, that's funny. So it's like, wait, this little passage kind of contradicts itself. Like, no. So you're telling me that the wife was the accountant. She just was working for her own family and not for a third party.
That is always seems like it kind of gets glossed over in this stuff. It's sort of like, well, they weren't allowed to do anything, and then it's like, but they were
doing everything. Like, they were literally just in a partnership with their husband and contributed to the family. They didn't go work for some stranger. I mean,
right? And so it's like, okay,
okay,
I don't know.
Yeah, it's just different. Yeah, very different. Yeah, no, I know. The way things are framed is very curious.
Yeah,
I'd be interested to hear what Stephanie would have. Stephanie, friend of the pod, Stephanie Leahy has to say about that. If you want to chat with us too, you can get in the Telegram, t.me/artofdarkpod. We have some very interesting discussions in there. A lot of times it's just posting links and memes. Posting stuff we like and memes and stuff. But if you want to show that you really know the show, get in there and post your favorite pen right away, and everybody will respect you. t.me/artofdarkpod. It's a lot of fun in there. Poor women's work was spinning and weaving. Okay, you're spinning and weaving. Okay, let's work. Yeah. Upper class wives with a house full of servants to tend to domestic matters often had much more free time. Well, no doubt, than as now. The most popular activities of such women were writing letters, singing, dancing, strolling in the garden, playing with dainty little pet dogs, and poring over needlework. Everything their education had prepared them for. Although some wives subsisted on the pious diet of religious sermons and the Bible, one upper-class woman spent an entire evening in her husband's chamber reading Turkish history and the poetry of Chaucer. Yeah, one of us.
Yeah, sounds great.
One foreigner thought that the freedom and leisure of these upper-class Elizabethan women qualified England as the paradise of married women, elaborating, they spend their free time in walking and riding and playing at cards or otherwise, in visiting their friends and keeping company, conversing with their equals, whom they term gossips, and making merry with them at childbirths, christenings, churchings, and funerals. And all this with the permission and knowledge of their husbands. Did you see that TikTok that went around that this sort of cute looking, maybe 20-something gal looked into look right into her phone and she goes, "You weren't born in the wrong century. You were born in the wrong social class." See,
Yeah, I did see that.
if you were born in Bridgerton times, you wouldn't be invited to the ball. You could maybe protest the ball, or maybe be a servant at the ball.
Right.
But or post online about, yeah, it's just like, and she's so right on. It's like, you're not born out of time. You just weren't born with a $5 million trust fund.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's true. That's true now for sure. Yeah.
Yep.
Though I would put a slight. Yeah, and this is weird because then I get to I put myself in a position where I'm slightly defending people that I don't necessarily consider myself on the same team as. I think there's like, if you were a member of the aristocracy, like De Vere, and we'll talk more about this obviously in the De Vere episode, but he'd be an example. You had a lot of money and it just sort of nothing happened. Like you didn't really do anything. And I think now a lot of, not every wealthy person, but a lot of wealthy people now kind of work their asses off.
Right.
It's like, it's very demanding on your time and your, mental capacity. And there was a whole class of people, and there's still some of that now. They didn't do anything. Right? Like they weren't subject to the same laws as everyone else. They just inherited money and titles. If they found they were running short, they would just like write a letter to the queen and they would say, can I get, there's got to be an opening in some do nothing job, right? Can I get that? And they would get it. It's very, right. It's like suddenly, oh, you're in charge of importing of wool. What do? I don't know. Somebody else actually does it, but I'm on the masthead, I'm on the masthead or whatever. So anyway, yeah. Times are the same. Nothing changes, but some things do.
Here's a little more about the relationship between men and women, particularly grooms and brides. But that last phrase about the permission of their husbands was the sticky bit for many an Elizabethan woman. Whatever freedom she had was granted and taken away by her husband. All the current notions about the ideal marriage gave him this authority. He was the prince with power, and his wife was his loyal, loving subject. Kate makes this perfectly clear at the end of The Taming of the Shrew as she lectures the other women on wifely duties. Thy husband is thy lord, thy life thy keeper, thy head thy sovereign, and craves no other tribute at thy hands but love, fair looks, and true obedience. Hoc tui. But in this... I'm really dating the podcast here with that, but
that's all right.
Yeah. In this scheme, the bad wife was a disobedient subject. Kate goes on, such duty as the subject owes the prince. Even such a woman oweth to her husband, and when she is froward, peevish, sullen, sour, and not obedient to his honest will, what is she but a foul contending rebel and graceless traitor to her loving lord?
Jeez.
That's patriarchy. That's what it was.
Right.
I mean, so there you go.
Yeah, this notion in the lower classes were like, well, okay, this house is based on making gloves. I make the gloves, and you do a bunch of other stuff, and together we kind of got a thing going here. That's a little different than like, you worship me, Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. And this is from that same book about tying the knot. Let's see here. These were the sorts of heartthrobs and undying loves and marital fantasies that occupied the minds and hearts and hormones of most Elizabethan teenagers throughout the age of adolescency. They wouldn't actually do anything about them for several years. For the marriage age was surprisingly late. For girls, 25 or 26, and for boys, 28 or 29, which is very surprising.
Yeah.
Baby brides like Juliet, who hath not seen the change of 14 years, or 15-year-old Miranda of the Tempest, were the exceptions, even for the upper classes. Mm. There were very practical reasons for putting off marriage. Later marriages meant smaller families, and in a society that was already bursting at the seams with people, big families meant big problems. Delayed marriage was the insurance policy Elizabethan society took out to guarantee that married couples would be financially able to support a family. The law that required apprenticeships to last 7 years was passed specifically to curb over hasty marriages and over soon setting up of households by youth. Fascinating.
Yeah.
We don't do anything like that now anymore, do we? It's like, go to university, go to grad school.
Right.
Career.
Right.
I mean,
yeah. We got to pay off your student loan before you go having a kid. I mean, are you crazy?
And you just blink and you're 39. Yeah.
Right.
In other words, people weren't allowed to marry until they were economically independent. And they weren't economically independent until they had reached an age where they had either saved money from their period of apprenticeship or inherited it from their parents. This reasoning was well-founded. Babies often followed close on the heels of marriage and were quite possibly the major cause of it. Yeah, they had pull-out technology had not yet been perfected at this point, apparently. Yeah. And always, I mean, but that old joke, right? What do you call people who use the rhythm method? Or use,
mom and dad,
parents. Yeah. So, probably 1 out of every 3 blushing Elizabethan brides was pregnant on her wedding day. This happened to the newlywed Shakespeare, whose first child was born a few months after his marriage to Anne Hathaway, and it happened to another Elizabethan couple who had themselves married and their baby baptized on the same day. Oh, scandalous.
Bunch of libertines. Jeez.
Yeah, sheesh. I mean, and then it goes on and it rehashes that business of the promise and the making sure. Let's see here. This was widely accepted, that practice, but not universally embraced. And then this is getting into, I'm going to go deep into 2 of the plays and the sonnets in the course of this episode. That's as the most we're going to be able to do in terms of the work. We're really going to look at Hamlet, and we're really going to look at The Tempest. And we're going to do that because we covered Hamlet in the book club, and Hamlet is a banger, and The Tempest because I love The Tempest. And people tend to leave The Tempest off their lists of their favorite Shakespeare's, and I freaking love it. I think it's incredible.
Oh, it's so good. Yeah.
And it's one of his, and I think it's probably his final play. It's like
it one is his final play. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. And the way that ends and the meta commentary that it is on the nature of theater and performance and drama and human nature. I love it. So although he celebrates the betrothal of his daughter, Miranda, Prospero feels called on to warn Ferdinand of dire consequences. If thou dost break her virgin knot, before all sanctimonious ceremonies may with full and holy rite be ministered. Often, you get an angry dad. Yeah. Often these betrothal arrangements spelled trouble, especially for young women. When Claudio and Juliet make such an arrangement in Measure for Measure, upon a true contract I got possession of Julieta's bed, Claudio vows. You know the lady, she is fast my wife, save that we do the denunciation lack of outward order. Julieta becomes pregnant. These pregnancies before the fact were generally tolerated, as long as the pregnant maid became the pregnant bride.
Right.
But sometimes, for one reason or another, the marriage ceremony didn't happen. The young girl's fiancé may have been forced into military service by a press gang, or perhaps the groom-to-be called things off when the bride's dowry didn't meet expectations.
Yeah.
Take my daughter, please. Here's a cow.
Right. Right.
Yeah. As Angelo is said to have done in Measure for Measure, when Mariana's brother was shipwrecked and her dowry lost just before the marriage. The treacherous Angelo swallowed his vows whole, pretending in her discoveries of dishonor. Or perhaps the betrothed was one who never means to wed where he hath wooed, as Katharina says in The Taming of the Shrew. When someone who under better circumstances would have been a pregnant bride became an unwed mother instead, the consequences were dire. She might be fired from her job and kicked out of the parish. Which job? I thought they didn't have jobs.
Right.
And even as she was in the throes of giving birth to this bastard infant, the midwife would refuse to lift a finger until she gasped out the name of the father.
Wow.
Damn. Oof.
I mean, I understand. It makes sense that you have social coercion systems in place to make, get the not to make things difficult for the mother, but just in general, it makes sense that you have these social systems in place to try and keep parents together, right? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. In a society where resources were already drained, women who brought bastards into the world, unless they could manage to find a man to support them, paid dearly. Small wonder some women resorted to the horrifying alternatives of herb-induced abortion and infanticide by poison or suffocation. So again, just a very gnarly world where the stakes are generally higher than our own. So yeah. Oof. Okay. Yep. But we got Willie Shakes is married.
Yeah, he did the right thing, right?
Yeah. I think that they probably, who knows if they had done the ceremony or if they had a whoopsie, but he stuck with her.
Yeah.
To a degree. Hey, sometimes an older woman, man.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I've heard that 8-year age gap in the 16th century, that's like a 20-year age gap. Now that's like,
right.
10, 15-year age gap. Anne, what are you doing? You're robbing the cradle.
Yeah.
that Anne Hathaway. All right. So Anne gives birth to a baby named Susanna. 2 years later, she would give birth to twins, Hamnet and Judith. Okay. After the twins' birth, and Hamnet.
Okay.
And Hamnet 2.0. 1.0. Now, okay, so and you can sort of tell as we're going along here that like it's church records that are like direct sources, and we're heading into, I guess, what would kind of be Act 2 of this episode, which is the big act. Let's say this has a 3-act structure. We've just had the childhood and his married life. That's Act 1. Young marriage. He's having children. He may have been a law clerk briefly. He may have gotten in trouble for poaching. He was certainly helping his father in some capacity. He had some schooling, but not what we would call university education.
He didn't go to Oxford, or
it would have been I don't know if there's a near equivalent now, but let's just think of him as like a high school graduate, maybe like a high school plus graduate. And after the twins are born, his trail goes cold until he appears in London in 1592. Yeah. So we're roughly,
which, by the way, is 2018. It's like a 4-year gap, 6-year gap.
Yeah, it's a serious gap, and we're going to talk about this. This period is known as his lost years. It's shrouded in mystery and speculation. One legend suggests he fled London to escape prosecution for poaching. Now that's tricky because it's like he already has a family and kids. So is he going out with the boys and like catching a deer on the DL? I guess he's still a young man.
I mean, their hunting is for recreation. We think of it as now, but at that time, that's probably a good supplement. It's sort of like there's a time of year like, hey, you should probably go snag a deer. We'll smoke it, and it supplements your diet. I think everybody probably hunted a little bit.
Yeah, everything's still a war for protein to this day.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I think we got a show title: William Shakespeare's War for Protein. No, that's a terrible title. It's a horrible title, I suppose. Yeah. So, right. There's another theory that he began his theatrical career by minding horses for theater patrons. So the fancy folks would come up and he would, take care of the horses, and he's sort of hanging around the theater. That's a theory. Yeah. Some even propose he worked as a country schoolmaster or was employed by a Catholic landowner named Alexander Houghton, who mentioned a William Shakeshaft in his will. However, these tales remain largely anecdotal, and there's little concrete evidence. So I've got something from Shakespeare.org.uk. Let's see here. And these are his lost years. Okay, I want to read some of this. John Aubrey wrote in 1681 that Willie had been in his younger years a schoolmaster in the country, which might well refer to Stratford. And of course, anything not London is like the country, the country.
Well,
it is like London, Manchester, a few other cities.
And there are places that were the country then that are now part of London.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. Now it's the M5 that circles the whole beast. Yeah, I got to get back over there, dude. I used to spend so much time over there. I might be going over next year for a thing.
Nice.
We will see. We got to do Art of Darkness live in London, dude. That's on the list. We got to rent a little theater out and do it. We got to do that. It'd be fun. Who would we do? Who would we do if we did London? Dickens? Dickens would be cool. That's a little on the nose, but
yeah. I'd want to do. I don't know. It's worth thinking about. There's plenty of candidates.
There's no bottom to. Blake would be cool. Very cool. Yeah. Okay. Others speculate that Willie was employed as a lawyer's clerk or became a soldier. It's also possible that he joined one of the companies of players which visited Stratford in the late 1580s. That's a funny image, too. He's got this young man with this young family, and the circus comes to town, and he's like, I'm off.
Right.
Okay. Gaps in the records of people's lives are not unusual, so the notion of lost years might even be construed as being sympathetic of too much biographical expectation and entitlement. Regardless of what happened during these years, we do know that he found himself an established playwright in London by 1592 as his plays began to be produced. All right. So it's a little bit about the lost years, and I think I have some more here. I'm going to get into... Now we're going to get into his time in London. So this is the thick of Act 2.
All right.
I'm just seeing what page I'm on to get a sense of my time here. What is going on? Why is it not showing me the pages, Brad?
I don't know.
Why? There it is. Okay.
Refresh
page 4 of 12. Page 4 of 12. Here we go.
Okay.
We're doing all right. We're good.
Yeah.
We're good. Hey, listen, his plays can run 3, 4, 5 hours.
That's true.
It can get real heavy.
Yeah.
So we're gonna get to London here. And this guy has such a great... And this is part 2 of his book, of the Ackroyd book. And I remember reading it, and I was like, oh, man, this guy, his prose really comes to life when he starts talking about London.
Yeah.
At some point after the wedding, Shakespeare made his way to London. We do not know the year of this very significant transition, but he must have left Stratford by 1586 or 87. There are references in several of his plays to an unhappy separation immediately after a wedding, but these may all be wholly dramatic devices. John Aubrey has a note on the subject that William, being inclined naturally to poetry and acting, came to London, I guess, about 18 and was an actor at one of the playhouses and did act exceedingly well. He was respected as an actor.
Right.
Aubrey would then guess his removal to London just after his marriage, as others have also supposed, but this seems to defy common sense and practical decency. We may give him the benefit of a little time with his bride. The probability must be that William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway, with their expected child, returned to the bridegroom's home in Henley Street. It was customary for a newly married couple to set up house with their own resources, but if that were not possible, the groom's father would offer lodging. With such a young bridegroom as Shakespeare, this must have been a necessity. It has been supposed that the newly married couple moved into the back extension of the house with its own solar or upstairs room and staircase, and so forth. I mean, it's sort of talking about their life after that. I wanted to get into the point where he's in London, so let me find that business. It's very interesting to think about him at like 18 and then like married, 3 children. Is he like coming and going from London and like getting her? What does that look like? And now at one point he would set up. Well, let's read a little more. Mm-hmm. It's very unusual. It's very like, I'm leaving my family to go to the city to make a career, right? I mean, it feels, I guess people still do it today, but.
Yeah, I don't know. It is interesting. I think there were, I'm sure it was contentious to a certain degree within the family.
You sort of have to think so, right?
Yeah.
The birth of the twins in the early spring of 1585 suggests that despite Aubrey's guess, Shakespeare was still with his wife in the spring of 1584. But no children were conceived by the Shakespeares after that date. In this, he did not follow the pattern of his parents, who produced 8 children over 22 years. He did not even follow the pattern of the time, in which very large families were common. At the birth of her twins, Anne Shakespeare was only 30 years old, and well within the age of childbearing. It may have been that the birth of Hamnet and Judith was in some ways injurious. In the conditions of Henley Street, however, it would have been inevitable that Anne and her husband slept in the same bed. In this period, too, there were no properly effective means of birth control. They may have abstained by mutual consent from sexual intercourse. All the evidence suggests, however, that Shakespeare was of a highly sexual nature. Well, he was an actor. I mean,
you got to be so horny to make theater.
You've got to be so horny to make theater. One of the greatest tweets of all time.
Yeah,
I can't remember who made that, but it's so funny. We're doing a play in October here in town. Doing my play moderation. Stay tuned. I don't know if I'm sufficiently horny anymore, Brad. We're gonna find out.
Gotta get your T levels checked.
There's one way to find out.
Well, yeah.
It is unlikely that in his early 20s he could have abstained without very good reason. The better explanation is also the more obvious one. He was not there. So where was he? And we'll see. He had plenty of opportunities to free Willie in the Capitol. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So there's this idea that he may have joined one of the companies and sort of taken it to London. Let's see here. I want to read about this fellow Tarleton. Let's see here. Tarleton epitomizes the nature of the theater which Shakespeare joined. He was the first great English clown, and I think this guy is the guy I was talking about earlier. Different guy, but we're going to talk about Kemp too later. But I want to get this in; it's so funny. And the most popular comedian of the Elizabethan age. As a fellow actor put it, there will never come his like, well, the earth can corn. Oh, passing fine Tarleton. He was said to have been discovered by the Earl of Leicester while keeping swine for his father, and the Earl was so delighted with his happy, unhappy answers that he enlisted him in his service. His jigs and ballads became famous in the 1570s, and he became attached to Queen Elizabeth's men on the formation of the group in 1583. There can be no doubt that Shakespeare witnessed his elaborate and idiosyncratic performances. Tarleton was also a playwright and wrote a comic drama entitled Play of the Seven Deadly Sins. He was a favorite of the Queen and became her unofficial court jester. That's such a great job to have.
Sure.
After his death in Shoreditch in 1588, an anthology entitled Tarleton's Jests became a popular favorite. In his will, he named as his trustee a fellow actor, William Johnson. Johnson also became, in turn, Shakespeare's trustee for the purchase of a house in Blackfriars. There is a connection, in other words, and it has often been suggested that Hamlet's reminiscence of Yorick is in recollection of Tarleton himself.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Tarleton's costume was a suit of russet and a buttoned cap. He carried a great bag by his side and wielded a large bat. He played on the tabor and pipe. We got to bring this shit back, dude.
Yeah,
this
it sounds fun. Yeah.
He had a squinty eye, a mustache, and a flat nose. He was, according to Stow, a man of wondrous, plentiful, pleasant, extemporal wit. He was the wonder of his time. He was material for endless anecdotes and allusions. He was the subject of nursery rhymes, and many alehouses were named after him, complete with his portrait. It was said that the sight of his face alone, peeping from behind the stage, was enough to send audiences into hysterics. He played the role of the country innocent in the city, complete with what might be called physical comedy. It meant that the comic actor became more important than any character or role he was performing. Tarleton would break off from his part and indulge in improvised repartee with the audience. For example, he would introduce jigs or comic business in the middle of the dramatic action. Hey, fuck it. We just go off script and start leaping around.
He sounds like fun. I feel like if you're getting bars named after you, you're a good hang. That's a good time.
Yeah, for real. Yeah, Tarleton's place. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, Tarleton's. Yeah, he specialized in grotesque faces and would pull them at inappropriate moments. He can claim to be the first star of the English stage.
Wow, cool.
All right, so there you go. A little bit about the period and what Shakespeare's living in here. Now, I want to get into some serious descriptions of London. I've got some different pages. Here we go. We're going to read a lot about this. Let's buckle up. It was an explosion of human energy. He had to reach it. Scholars and biographers have argued about the exact date of his arrival, but his destination was not in doubt. Others had made the journey from Stratford to London in the same period. His contemporary Richard Field had gone from the King's New School to be enrolled as an apprentice. Roger Locke, son of John Locke the Glover, had also taken up an apprenticeship in the city. Richard Quiney became a London merchant, as did his cousin John Sadler. Another native of Stratford, John Lane, journeyed from London to the Levant on a merchant ship. They may all have agreed this home-keeping youth have ever homely wits. In Shakespeare's plays, too, young men often chafe and complain at being kept rustically at home. They wish to speed away and be free, on the wind of their instinct and ambition. Goethe once wrote that in stillness talent forms, but character is created in the great current of the world. The case of William Shakespeare, however, is singular in more than one sense. None of his contemporaries made their departures from wives or children. It was, in fact, almost unprecedented for a young man to leave behind his young family. It was unusual even in aristocratic households. It suggests, at the very least, strong determination and single-mindedness on Shakespeare's part. He had to leave. That's assuming if he existed at all. Are we getting the story straight? I don't know. Brad will correct us.
Yeah. I've got some stuff on that. Yeah.
Yep. So going on. Let's see. He left with a plan and a purpose. He may conceivably have been accepting an invitation from a group of players, and the prospects of making money as a player were greater than those currently available for a provincial lawyer's clerk. They made money too. These guys got rich. It'd be like going to Hollywood and actually making it, becoming an A-list celebrity. I'm getting $800,000 for my next bit part, whatever. I mean, you make it. If the best, so here, it was soon commonly reported of players that some have gone to London very meanly and have come in time to be exceedingly wealthy. If the best means of supporting his young family were to be found in London, then to London he must go. In the lives of great men and women, however, there is a pattern of destiny, which we track on Art of Darkness.
That's right. That's true.
Time and place seem in some strange way to shape themselves around them as they move forward. There would be no Shakespeare without London. Some oblique or inward recognition of that fact spurred his determination. In his observations on translating Shakespeare, Boris Pasternak wrote that at this time Shakespeare was led by a definite star, which he absolutely trusted. James Joyce, friend of the pod, noted that banishment from the heart, banishment from home, is a dominant motif in Shakespeare's drama. That may better fit Joyce's own, exilic status, but it has an authentic note. Shakespeare's star may have led him from home, but it would still be natural to look back at what had been lost. Joyce could only write about Dublin after he had left it. All right. Okay. This is really going to get into some of this description of London that I've been teasing. There were two roads to London. The shorter route would have taken him through Oxford and High Wycombe, and the other route arrived in the capital by way of Banbury and Aylesbury. John Aubrey connects him with a small village on a side road of the Oxford route. In Grendon Underwood, the dramatist is supposed to have found the model for Dogbury, but any talk of models is misplaced. Shakespeare would, in subsequent years, however, become thoroughly familiar with the wooded regions and ridges of the Chilterns, the valley of the Great Ouse. I don't know how to say that. Ouse, O-U-S-E. The villages and market towns that characterize these journeys. The modern roads follow much the same path through a transformed landscape. As sensible as Shakespeare was, he would have set out in late spring or early summer. It was good traveling weather. He might have gone in company as a safeguard against thieves or traveled with the Stratford London carriers. The principal one of these, William Greenaway, was a neighbor in Henley Street. On his pack horses, he took cheese and brawn, lambskins and linseed oil, woolen shirts and hose to the capital, where he exchanged them for city goods such as spices and silverware. The journey by foot lasted for 4 days. By horse, it took only 2. It's not as bad as you'd maybe think. Like the UK, that's a small island by American standards.
Yeah, it is.
You can get back and forth in a couple of days. I mean, it'd be like driving from LA to New York. Like pain in the butt, but you could do it. You could do it in, if you really push and you're sharing, you can do it in 2 days.
Yeah.
Or from let's say Minnesota to Texas, right?
Yeah.
And then as Shakespeare approached the city, He saw the pall of smoke. He heard it, a confused roar striated with bells. He smelled it too. The distinct odor of London penetrated some 25 miles on all sides. Still does. One route took him to the north by way of Highgate, but the more direct led him into the heart of the capital. It passed the hamlet of Shepherd's Bush and the gravel pits at Kensington, crossing the Westburn Brook and the Maryburn Brook, until it reached the hanging tree of Tyburn. Here, the road parted, one path going toward Westminster and the other toward the city itself. If Shakespeare had chosen the city route, as is most likely, he traveled down the Oxford Road to the church and village of St. Giles in the Fields. It was his first sight of the London suburbs, or in the words of John Stow's Survey of London, published in 1598, "Here have ye many fair houses builded, and lodgings for gentlemen, inns for travelers, and such like up almost, for it lacketh but little, to St. Giles in the Fields." But the suburbs also had a reputation for lawlessness, where a great number of dissolute, loose, and insolent people harbored in such the like noisome and disorderly houses, as namely poor cottages, the habitations of beggars, and people without trade, stables, inns, alehouses, taverns, garden houses, converted to dwellings, ordinaries, dicing houses, bowling alleys, and brothel houses. The young, I like that, like bowling and then brothels.
Right.
The young Shakespeare had never seen anything like it before. He must have found it, in the phrase of Charlotte Bronte, used when she first entered the city, deeply exciting. Then onwards toward the bars of Holborn, past struggling lines of shops and tenements, yards and inns, and towards the terrible prison of Newgate. This was the gateway of London, the flower of cities all. A traveler entering the city for the first time could not help but be profoundly moved or disturbed by the experience. It assaulted all of the senses with its stridency and vigor. It was a vortex of energy. It was voracious. The traveler was surrounded by street traders or by merchants beseeching him to buy. He was hustled and jostled. It was a city of continuous noise, of argument, of conflict, of street selling, of salutations such as "God ye good morrow" and "God ye good den." And more often than not, it smelled terribly of dung and offal and human labor.
Yeah.
Some of the phrases of the streets are deeply redolent of London life. "Go to, you are a whore of your tongue," and "as much worth as a piss in the Thames." If you were snout fair, you were good looking, and to have sex was to occupy.
Nice.
Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah.
I like that, to occupy.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
There were, I mean, it is what happens.
Yeah.
There were merchants standing in the doorways of their shops, lounging about, picking their teeth. Their wives were inside, sitting on joint stools, ready to bargain with the customers. Apprentices stood outside the workshops of their masters, calling out to passers-by. Householders, as often as not, took up positions on their doorsteps where they might trade gossip or insults with their neighbors. There was no privacy in the modern sense of the word. There were rows of shops, all in one vicinity, selling the same limited range of goods: cheeses, pickles, gloves, spices. There were dimly lit basements entered by stone steps from the streets where sacks of corn or malt were stacked up for sale. There were old women crouched upon the ground with parcels of nuts or withered vegetables spread out around them. There were street sellers with their goods piled high on wooden trays hung about their necks. There seemed to be endless numbers of men carrying sacks and burdens on their backs, weaving through the crowds that packed the narrow streets. The children were busily at work alongside the adults, too, wheeling barrows or calling out for trade. People ate pies or small roasted birds as they walked, throwing the bones of the thrush into the roadway. There were literally hundreds of ballad sellers, singing men or singing women, who stood at street corners or on barrels to advertise their wares. There were alleys that seemed to lead nowhere, ruinous gates and tenements encroaching upon the streets, sudden flights of steps, gaping holes and rivulets of filth and garbage. He goes hard, this author. He loves this.
Yeah, it's pretty great.
That's great. It was already an ancient place inhabited for more than 1,500 years, and it savored of age and decay. John Stow loved to survey the ruins of ancient times in the 16th century streets through which he walked. In shape and texture, it was still a medieval city with the old walls and gatehouses as chapels and barns. The sites of the monasteries and priories, some of them dismantled as a result of Henry's dissolution, but others put to new use, were still marked out as precincts and liberties. The Palace of the Savoy, linked with the French wars of Edward III, survived. The Earl of Warwick's house in Dowgate between Walbrook and the Thames still stood. The Tower of London, to which Shakespeare adverted more than any other edifice in his plays, still watched over the city, and you can still see it. Mm. Stone House in Lombard Street was known as King John's house. Crosby Hall, where Richard III was supposed to have accepted the crown of England, endured. It was only to be expected that Shakespeare's history plays would be imagined within the very heart of the city where he lived and worked. Okay. This is I want to read something here too that is important. But the miracle of late 16th century London lay in the fact that it was renewing itself. Its vigor and energy came from the fresh access of youthfulness. It has been estimated that half of the urban population was under the age of 20.
Whoa, wow, yeah, okay.
This is what rendered it so strident, so tough, so excitable. Never again would it be so young. Apprentices made up 10% of its population, and apprentices were known for their high spirits and for their occasional tendency towards violence. You'd wear a sword out. You'd be walking around with a fucking sword.
Right. Yeah.
We need to return. We need to go back. Londoners were often compared to a swarm of bees, quick to congregate and to act in instinctive union. All right. So there you go.
It's an exciting place to be.
Yeah, there's no other place on that island that would make sense for him, I don't think.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I got a little more here. Let's see. I love that stuff. I love that town. I mean, I really do. Spent a lot of time over there. All right. And this is where he starts his career. All right. So
1592.
Yeah, well, and I'm going to come. Yeah. I'm going to go back to the Shakespeare Alive book for a couple of things. Okay. This is more about London, the city that never sleeps. What a world too! Yeah. You could book it. You could book a one-way ticket and go over there. Although they'd want to see your return flight, Brad, because they don't want you sticking around there too.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you could. No, it's not that big. My wife went there earlier this year.
Yeah, you got to go. So. 100 miles and several days later, as the sun comes up, London also rises above the green fields. And this is from coming from Avon, from Stratford. As you enter the city gates, you draw your breath in wonder. The city you have come to, the largest in all of Europe, is noisy and bustling. At its heart is the River Thames, the center of trade and social life. You see the opulent state barge of the Queen moored on the bank and marvel at how many watermen, the taxi drivers of the city, are rowing from one riverbank to the other. You get lost in the narrow, winding streets as you stare up at the looming Tower of London. You are nearly run over by one of the many coaches that are causing perpetual gridlock in the city. You hear vendors hawking hot peas or new brooms, green brooms. Their voices mix with the pitiful moans and cries of the prisoners in the tower to create a deafening and exhausting hubbub. It is hard to believe how many people live here, well over 100,000. Although you're slightly overwhelmed by it all, you decide to do what you came here for and begin looking for work. Unfortunately, everyone else is doing the same. The market is saturated with laborers and prospects are not good. Most days you just sit around hoping something will come your way. You wonder what will become of you. There isn't any formal system of welfare to support the unemployed, no food stamps, no soup kitchens. Together with other migrants just like you huddle in a cold attic and share memories of what each of you has left behind. You yourself recall the small stone cottage that you lived in all of your life. Although it was only one room, and what little furniture you had was very rough. Although your bed was of straw and your sheets were of canvas, still it was home, and it was better than this smelly tenement where all of you are sleeping on the floor. An old man in the room, once the servant of a prosperous farmer, describes the opulent house of his former employer. So many rooms and carpets on the floor, woven tapestries on the walls, carved oak woodwork, lots of candles giving light, and the ultimate luxury, feather beds. He remembers serving his first Christmas dinner at the house, at the long table in the great hall, or dining room, he'd never seen so much meat on one table: beef, pork, veal, venison, game. There were oysters and eel, cabbage and carrots, some delicious finely ground bread, dried fruit, and wines imported from the French or German countryside. As you listen to his description, you wonder how the rich aren't chronically constipated with all that meat. In your own little cottage, the fare was usually coarse brown bread, cheese and eggs, the occasional chicken or hunk of bacon. Everything used to be cheap, 2 loaves of bread for a penny. But in the last few wretched years, prices have risen enormously, and food for the poor like you has become scarce. With the onset of famine, you had to resort to eating bread, peas and beans, and whatever else you could hunt up in the woods around the village. So there you are.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And it goes on. 2 would-be apprentices, fresh from the alehouses, tumble into the already crowded rooms, singing the praises of beer. Indeed, again, nothing changes. The constant friend to all of you during these times of tribulation is beer. Imported wines are too costly. Tea and coffee are still luxuries, but beer is cheap to make and a regular feature of social life. Everyone drinks it, even your young brothers and sisters back in the village. Sometimes, admittedly, people go overboard. At local fairs and county markets, scores of people regularly end up lying dead drunk in the field. And drinking seems to provide the same comfort here in London. The alehouses are always full. You can find one on nearly every corner. A Frenchman was provoked to remark that no business could be done in England without pots of beer. But the truth is that alcohol helps people forget the strains of life. It flows freely in the prisons and during outbreaks of the plague. At public executions, the person condemned to death is always offered a drink.
Yeah.
You can understand why. A beer or two eases the hardships of daily existence, the lack of jobs, the high prices, the scarcity of food, the awful diseases, and all the other things that make life so hard. Indeed, sickness and death are regular features of life in this enormous city you've come to. Disease is even more prevalent here and in the squalid suburbs you passed on your way into London than in the impoverished village you left behind. The contagious bubonic plague is the #1 killer. Coming in at a close second is smallpox, which blinds or disfigures the people it doesn't actually kill. Your beautiful little sister has been left pockmarked for life, and tuberculosis takes lives daily. The spread of infectious diseases is furthered by the total ignorance about personal and public hygiene. Rich and poor alike don't bathe very often. The poor can't afford the high prices of soap and don't have the facilities. The toothbrush won't come on the scene for another 70 years. Most Elizabethans, and you are no exception, have bad breath, rotting teeth, constant stomach disorders, and scabs or running sores all over their skin.
Nice.
Woo!
Wow.
And there's another paragraph. Medicare or Medicaid doesn't exist.
Right.
Well,
Right.
It's the UK.
Yeah.
But that's really funny. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that they may be overstating it a bit, but yeah, let's remember we're not in the modernity here.
Yeah. Well, and also that just on the alcohol thing too. I mean, I think everybody knows this. The alcohol, if you have contaminated water, drinking alcohol, drinking beer is actually probably better for you. And then also,
it'd be very small ABV. I mean, it would be very, very,
right. It's like 2% or whatever, right?
Sure,
that's enough to kill some of the bugs. But then also you've got this young population too, right? That's probably kind of running roughshod over the entire culture, really. So, half the country's, if you get enough boisterous young men, and there's not enough other men to kind of keep them sort of tamped down, things can get pretty wild.
Well, I mean, but it also produced Shakespeare. I mean, this was his milieu and also his audience.
Yeah.
I mean, theater, it's so funny too, because America does theater upside down. So it's funny that in America, theater is an old person's thing. That's upside down.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things is when in South Park, the men discover that if they take their wives to the musicals, they'll get the Haktua. You remember that episode?
I didn't see that one. No.
Well, they use it to promote the Book of Mormon, right?
Sure.
Which is hilarious, right? Yeah. And but in the episode, I think it's one of the kids is it Gary? One of the dads
Mm.
gets dragged to a musical or like forced to take his wife to a musical, and
Yeah.
he gets the best sex of his life, and
Right.
he tells the other men, and they
Yeah.
all get super into musicals to the point where they kind of become gay. I think a
Right.
little bit, it's a classic South Park episode.
Yeah.
It's really, really, really funny because
Yeah.
they realize theater will get them laid. And I'm just
Right.
telling you, as like, this is like, this is not a go on a theater date sometime, friends.
Sure.
Try
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Try it. See how
Yeah.
you're doing.
Yeah.
You're out on the dating apps. I'm not. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to be a first date unless you're like theater
Okay.
people.
Right. Right.
But you could even suggest it. You could say, do you like the theater? You like going to a
Yeah.
show?
Oh, I'll tell you, it's a fun date. Something actually,
it's not always a first date.
No,
Yeah.
no, probably not a first
It's not
date
it's not a first date because it's a lot of a commitment, right?
Right,
But
right.
after the coffee date, after you start a podcast together,
Right.
yeah. But at third, fourth date, you're really hitting it off. Hey, let's go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. You go
Yeah.
and something actually happens.
Something happens that you can
Right. Other than you just
sort of discuss.
other than you just buying something, food
And I'm going to tell you, if you're
yeah.
in the business of if you're a courting,
Mm-hmm.
even if the play sucks, you win. Because then you get to bitch with the other, you get to trauma bond about how much it sucks.
Exactly. Oh, stupid. That was so boring. Like, even that's kind of fun. Yeah. Yeah.
There is a great deal of untapped eros in the American theater because it has been hijacked like everything else.
It's been like
by the
PBS-ified
gerontocracy. It's been PBS-ified. It's been NPR-ified.
Right.
And we have to do everything in our power to fight that.
Yeah, and it got into all of our heads that like going to the theater was like it's school or like taking your vitamins or something.
Eat your broccoli.
Yeah.
And all the people who are involved in that cursed hegemony, you're going to get exactly what you deserve, which is crummy art that nobody cares about. And then everybody's going to they all wring their hands and go, why is nobody coming? It's because it just sucks, because it's boring, because you've turned it into school, because we don't want our free time to feel like public school.
Right.
Or private school, or school at all.
Yeah.
In any case, you're listening to the Art of Darkness podcast, a podcast about the dark side of creativity. I'm Kevin Couchman. I'm Pulp. This is Slick, Brad Kelly. Brad, your next episode is definitely going to be the DeVere episode. We're doing that. That's coming up soon.
Yeah. Yes.
So that's going to be fun. This is a special thing we're doing. We're covering Shakespeare twice. We're covering the real Shakespeare and then the other Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm. And then you guys, the audience, gets to decide which one of those is which.
You get to decide, and we want to hear from you. Again, there's a Telegram chat, t.me/artofdarkpod. You can email us at artofdarkpod@gmail.com. We love hearing from people. We especially love hearing from patrons. We're active. Brad manages the Substack for our subs, and I manage the Patreon for our Patreon patrons. And it really is good to hear from people when we take suggestions, we take recommendations. People say, "Hey, we want you to do this." I don't remember how this concept emerged, Brad. I think there was a minute where the Oxfordian Stratfordian debate was a hot topic on the Bird website.
Hotter than it has been recently. But let's see if we can kick it up a notch.
Yeah, well, let's see if we can kick it back up again. I mean, if everybody has a really, really strong opinion too, we would love to hear from people, like genuinely. Okay, so this is from Shakespeare Live, more about London and the background of the theater. If the young Mr. Shakespeare had arrived in London in the mid-1570s and asked the way to the theater district, he probably would have met with blank stares. Or if he were unlucky enough to have stopped a Puritan with his question, he might have gotten a half-hour lecture on the evils of stage plays. In Shakespeare's London, there was nothing like New York City's Broadway or London's West End. Anything approaching theatrical organization was just beginning to crystallize. At the core of this process were the professional acting companies of men and boys, which were evolving through the years from groups of itinerant players to permanent organizations based in London. The minstrel bands of the Middle Ages, the wandering forefathers of the 16th century actors, split into two groups over time. The musicians, what we now think of as minstrels, and the professional dramatic players who were still under the protection of a nobleman. For those strolling players, being on tour was a way of life. What did he say when he got arrested? This is gonna hurt the tour. What tour? The world tour. We're bringing sexy back on an Art of Darkness. But their touring wasn't a matter of fixed concert dates, enormous stadiums, record-breaking advance sales, or wildly screaming fans. They moved randomly from town to countryside, from aristocratic banqueting halls to humble village greens, sometimes heading to London for the winter court season and in-yard performances, going wherever the business might be. Traveling in small groups, or usually no more than 3 or 4 men, with a couple of small wagons and a horse or two to carry the heavier baggage. Their usual procedure upon arriving in a new town was to meet with the mayor, present their letter of introduction, and get a license from him, allowing them to perform in the town square or in the cloisters under the town library. These strolling troops of actors lived from hand to mouth, never sure what kind of reception or earnings lay inside a town's walls. They were casually organized, loosely strung together, and living for the moment. In fact, they were too casually organized for some village and town authorities who considered them annoyances, as much a threat to a community's peace and quiet as any other vagrant and homeless types. But whenever an authority figure threatened to make real trouble for them, the players scurried to take refuge in their status as servants of a nobleman. They would waive their letters of introduction or recommendations in the face of any petty official who had the nerve to threaten them, daring him to go against the honorable protection of the Earl of such and such or Lord so and so. Few local authorities brazened out that dare. So they had like a letter of marque almost. They had their passport to get into town. Hey, we're going to put on a show. They would go on tour.
Right. That's fun. That sounds like a ball.
Yeah, I mean, listen.
Right.
Hey, what happens on tour? I mean, hey, we're going town to town, right? The truth of the matter, however, was that many of these noble patrons didn't have the slightest idea of what their alleged servants were actually doing. Many times the traveling players were servants in name only, wearing the protective colors or the livery of the household without performing any of the typical servants' duties and without receiving regular wages. They had the best of both worlds, the freedom accorded to vagabonds and the protection accorded to employees of a household. By the second half of the 16th century, the control and supervision of these wandering actors had grown very lax. Small bands were wandering all over the countryside without any regulation, their numbers multiplying.
Oh, no, they weren't regulated.
Finally, the government took steps to remedy the situation. First, by passing an act against illegal retainers or masterless men, servants who wore the livery but didn't do the work. The crackdown continued with the Act for the Punishment of Vagabonds, which put the traveling actors outside the law. All fencers, bear wards, because they would do bear baiting, they'd do bear shows or whatever, common players in interludes, and minstrels, not belonging to any baron of this realm or towards any other honorable personage of greater degree, shall be taken, adjudged, and deemed rogues, vagabonds, and sturdy beggars.
Sturdy beggars. Rogues, vagabonds, and sturdy beggars. All right.
I think that's a show title there.
Yeah, could be.
Yeah, rogues, vagabonds, and sturdy podcasters.
Yes.
The law was unequivocal and the penalties brutal. On the first offense alone, these unfortunates were to be grievously whipped and burnt through the gristle of the right ear with a hot iron.
Good Lord.
Yeah, good Lord is right. The poor players were in a no-win situation. If they were found wandering around performing without the protection of a nobleman, they were vagabonds. If they did have a noble's patronage, they had to prove that they were servants in the true sense of the word and not actors.
You're not. What kind of actor are you?
Right. What kind of actor? What's funny is this is the same thing. It's like now, like right wing Twitter loves to do this. It's like, oh, you got an arts degree, make my coffee.
Right.
Go fix my coffee.
Yeah,
oh, you got a degree in acting.
Yeah,
I'll see you at McDonald's.
Right.
Democratize the shame and the.
Meanwhile, what does everybody do with their downtime? Fucking stream Netflix, content made by artists.
Sure. But it has the imprimatur of the nobility, the Hollywood nobility, the studio nobility. So again, nothing changes, everything changes. Yeah. The story of the Earl of Leicester's men is a perfect example of how a company survived the stringent new regulations. Hang on, I missed a part here. The effect of the Act of 1572 might have been to squelch English drama for good, but what happened instead was that many of the hangers-on disappeared, while players who really did have aristocratic backing found other ways to continue their playing, namely as permanent professional companies in London.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it has this unusual effect of actually making the problem worse in a way. It's funny because like it sounds like the cities were just sick of them. Because I can about imagine though, because you can about imagine how like sexually severe everything was, which we just covered, and now and you've got like 100 wandering bands of actors who come into your town waving the letter of a nobleman saying, we got to let us hang out here.
Just like rootless, horny young people. Yeah.
Yeah. Bopping from town to town. It's like a punk band, playing a punk show in some basement and the cops want to raid it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not wildly different to the point where they had to pass a law saying y'all are just vagabonds. You're just bums. Back to the city with you.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Earl of Leicester's men, when a statute against illegal retainers first came out, they panicked, for although they were card-carrying members of the Earl of Leicester's household, they really didn't have much formal standing with him. They wrote a letter immediately begging him to keep them on as legitimate servants so they could still claim his patronage and protection under the new law. The Earl's reply was far more generous than they could have hoped for. The Earl was an arts respecter. I like that. We need, it's so tricky, man. Not only did he offer them his protection, but in 1574, word came down from the Queen herself, overriding the opposition of the city authorities was one of the privileges of being queen, that the Earl of Leicester's men were to be allowed to perform their plays in London. The document conferred this privilege, royally proclaimed that Leicester's men could now use, exercise, and occupy the art and faculty of playing comedies, tragedies, interludes, and stage plays, as well for the recreation of our loving subjects, as for our solace and pleasure when we shall think good to see them. I'll come too. The group of actors must have been overjoyed. What better protection could there be than that given by Queen Elizabeth herself? One of Leicester's players was James Burbage, that ex-carpenter turned full-time actor. Combining his two crafts, Burbage used the royal support as the cornerstone for the first custom-made theater building in England. Okay. All right. So you got it.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, cool.
So now we're getting into Shakespeare's time. All right.
Excellent.
And so this is where he becomes sort of the playwright and the poet that we know. So over a period of about 20 years, Shakespeare wrote approximately 39 plays. It's 2 plays a year if they're all genuinely his.
Yeah.
It's a lot, but it's possible. And if you're working in a craft, like obviously he created great art, but this was workmanlike. It's almost like he was like a TV writer for his time. We got to have a new show. These actors, they would memorize
deadlines too. It's like we're doing the show.
They would memorize. They'd have memorized multiple parts in multiple plays.
Yeah. That's amazing.
I don't know how they did it. I haven't uncovered anything that explains it. I just think that they were just so in it. And it was their bread and butter, and there was good money in it. And I'm sure there are living actors now who could do it, who could do Hamlet one night and then do Mackers the next night.
Well, I'm convinced that people's memories used to be better.
I think so.
Like, not 10 times better, but enough better that it made a difference. Yeah.
Well, there was no fluoride in the water.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, they still don't fluoridate their water over there too, which and we know fluoride. In any case, that's for the podcast Down by the Docks.
Right.
Yeah, we should start a podcast called the podcast Down by the Docks.
By the Docks.
That would be Down by the Docks podcast.
Yeah. Ranting and raving.
It's just we're screaming into the void. Like literally, none of our audience comes over.
We might have to actually use different names for that.
Right. Down by the Docks with Pulp and Slick, an Art of Darkness podcast that nobody wants.
That nobody wants.
All right.
Just be about watching us gradually become boomers. That's what it would be.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. 39 plays, 154 sonnets, and 2 long narrative poems. His plays cover a range of genres, including histories, tragedies, comedies, and romance. And I'm just going to blast through some of the names of these. The early works: Comedy of Errors, The Taming of the Shrew. And The Taming of the Shrew is originally based on something called A Taming of a Shrew. And then it might have been one of his earlier works that he then changed. A lot of this stuff, it's not clear. Did he adapt? Was there an existing script that he punched up and polished? You could go Shakespeare scholarship. I mean, in terms of like Wikipedia, and I know Wikipedia is a bit of a dirty word sometimes, but like you could spend all day clicking every Wikipedia and I don't even know how many pages, probably be 1,000 pages if you clicked every link on Shakespeare. Every play, there's voluminous, certainly it'd be hundreds and hundreds of pages. All right. So The Comedy of Errors, The Taming of the Shrew, Henry VI, Tragedies, Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Mackers, Midsummer Night's Dream, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Much Ado About Nothing, As You Like It, Twelfth Night, Richard III, Henry IV, Henry V, Julius Caesar, which is a banger, Antony and Cleopatra, The Tempest, The Winter's Tale, and Cymbeline. Most playwrights of his time collaborated with others, and critics agree that he did as well, particularly early and late in his career. The first recorded works of Shakespeare include Richard III and the 3 parts of Henry VI, written in the early 1590s during a vogue for historical drama. However, dating Shakespeare's plays precisely is challenging. Studies suggest that Titus Andronicus, The Comedy of Errors, The Taming of the Shrew, and The Two Gentlemen of Verona may also belong to his earliest period. His first histories, heavily drawing from the 1587 edition of Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, dramatize the destructive results of weak or corrupt rule and are often seen as justifying the origins of the Tudor dynasty.
Okay.
It could do worse. I mean, if you're getting the patronage of the king, you sort of make a case for their sovereignty and their sort of God-granted authority.
Well, you don't want to. I mean, since it's kind of legally and socially precarious, you want to be careful that if you're gonna say something against the regime, that it counts, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed. It is true. All right. The early plays were influenced by other Elizabethan dramatists like Thomas Kidd and Christopher Marlowe. Do you know much about Christopher Marlowe, Brad?
I do know a bit about Christopher Marlowe. Yeah.
What do you know?
He's one of the other candidates for possibly being Shakespeare. The challenge to that is that he died